The winter sun burned bright over Tokyo on the first day of December, but without warming the Shinjuku ghetto in the slightest. The cold winds blowing from the west the night before had brought a wet slush to the Tokyo settlement, and now the cracked asphalt of the streets of Shinjuku was covered in a rime of filthy ice. Kaname-ogi cursed as he nearly slid on a patch of the black ice, only maintaining his balance at the cost of pulling his hands from the warm pockets of his jacket and windmilling frantically. Grumbling with irritation, Ogi shoved his hands back into the meager warmth of his jacket, set his shoulders against the cruel breeze that had begun whipping itself back up again, and continued on his way down the nearly empty street. The near-total lack of any other pedestrians did nothing to improve the former teacher's mood, not when he knew the weather didn't explain the empty streets, nor did the presence of the sole vehicle out this morning, slowly plodding its way over the ice. Death in Shinjuku was common, easy to come by, and generally unaccompanied by any sort of celebration or commemoration of the deceased. Children and adults alike died of disease, of hunger, of accidental injuries turning infected for lack of the antibiotics readily available outside of the walls, and by bad luck every day in Shinjuku. It was impossible to truly mourn each dead family member, every dead friend, every neighborhood face that just seemingly vanished overnight, never to be seen again. As years had dragged on and the situation had gone from bad to worse for the once citizens of Tokyo, Ogi had seen more men and women than he'd care to remember dying from overdoses, from self-neglect, and from violence of all types. Worst of all were the ones who died by their own hands, intentional or otherwise. A particularly haunting memory was of a family who had lived in an apartment in the same building as him during the first winter after the conquest, before most people had the opportunity to learn about things like heating your room in the absence of central heating or a reliable electrical supply. The father of the family had found a charcoal burning heater somewhere, possibly a sports store, and had lit it in his enclosed apartment without opening a window or door. Ogi had helped the other young men move the bodies down 4 flights of stairs to the curb outside the building once they began to stink, the warmth of the heater adequate to stave off the cold that might have kept putrefaction at bay. Hauling the bodies to the curb was more or less the extent of the funerary service in Shinjuku. Wood and other useful burnable materials were in far too high a demand to be used for pyres, not when every scrap of lumber was earmarked for desperately needed repairs and patches in crumbling Shinjuku. Being part of the urban core, non-developed land was also at a premium, and virtually every inch of land not covered in pavement was needed to grow supplemental produce, and thus was guarded jealously. No room for the dead in the ground of Shinjuku. And so, deprived of the options of honorable burial or respectful burning, the people of Shinjuku had turned to dumping their dead at the roadside. After a few sheet-wrapped bundles had begun to accrue, the surviving families or their neighbors, or in the more well-managed parts of Shinjuku the locally organized public committee, would club together to hire one of the few trucks available in Shinjuku and haul the dead away for dumping. Recognizing that a complete collapse of sanitation in Shinjuku would reduce the public health of their own people sooner or later, the Britannians had designated a dumping area in the southern end of the Shinjuku ghetto, near a heavily defended checkpoint with an entrance gate large enough to permit the passage of garbage trucks. The dumping area, cleared via bulldozer of all old structures or roads, was studded with large dumpsters, which would be regularly emptied out by the garbage trucks. These dumpsters were the only way to remove non-recyclable, non-burnable garbage from the ghetto, and were the penultimate resting places for all who died in Shinjuku, before they were carted off to a landfill who knew where by the Britannian sanitation authorities. One such truck was slowly making its way down the street ahead of Ogi, stopping by each ice-frosted parcel, the sheets or rags serving as shrouds wet from the cold rain and snowmelt. At each stop, 2 men riding on the tailgate jumped down and began tossing the bodies up onto the open bed of the truck as quickly as possible, showing as much regard for the dead as they would for any other trash. Dimly, Ogi noted that the truck bed was already nearly covered in a layer of wrapped bodies, and the back of the bed near the cab was double-stacked already. Busy day for the haulers. Lately, the haulers had been doing a very brisk business. Between the ongoing spat of gang wars, the cold wet air that leached heat from frail bodies, and the already abandoned effort to retrieve the bodies from the collapsed portions of Shinjuku Gyome Station before they began to stink, the going rate for their services had climbed rapidly. While the necessity of the haulers' services was obvious, it was galling for Ogi to think about anybody profiting off the misery of his people, and the fact that at least some of the hauling crews were affiliated to various gangs rubbed salt in the wound. It made a kind of sense, after all, Getting fuel and spare parts in the ghetto practically required gang connections, but the idea that the gangs were getting paid to clean up the unfortunates caught up in their war. Reaching the next intersection, Ogi thankfully turned his back on the truck and its grim burden, doing his best to shift his mind away from yet another horrible aspect of life in Shinjuku he could do nothing about. Instead, the teacher and rebel leader turned his mind towards a task he had, if he were being honest, been putting off for the last 2 days. Today's going to be the day, though, Ogi resolved as he turned his wandering feet back towards the apartment he shared with Naoto and Tanya. Further delay's not going to help anybody, and Tanya's out of the house today. Apparently, Callan had taken the initiative and had invited Tanya on another trip through the Tokyo settlement. Ostensibly, it was to get a second opinion on various food and second-hand clothing purchases the Rising Sun was planning, as well as to get the younger girl's feedback in regards to an idea Suichiro of all people had come up with. The former police officer, from a family native to the rural province of Gunma, had proposed that Rising Sun purchase laying chickens and the materials to create a number of coops around the Shinjuku ghetto, to provide a steady source of eggs, meat, and employment to the locals. The birds could be fed in part with plant material and edible to humans, Suichiro had claimed, and partly with cheap grains purchased in bulk, and would help provide greater self-sufficiency to the ghetto. Ogi personally wasn't entirely on board with the idea, since any potential yield from the coops would be months in coming, months when the cheap grain fed to the birds could be used to feed the people instead, but he was content to follow Tanya's lead on the proposal. More importantly from Ogi's point of view was that Tanya's outing with Callan was clearly an excuse for Callan to hang out and socialize with her nominal junior, with the work topic acting as justification to convince the overly diligent Tanya to quit working and enjoy a day of walking around the Britannian concession. Ogi wished the red-headed girl good luck with her endeavor, and hoped she took the opportunity to feed Tanya a large meal in the process. He knew that getting Tanya to quit focusing on work long enough to eat, much less have any sort of fun, was a Herculean task. Callan's annoyingly stubborn too, so she's got a chance. Ogi smirked slightly as he leaned into the chilly wind at the idea of the battle of wills no doubt unfolding, amusing himself with the image of Callan dragging a recalcitrant Tanya away from a rack of canned goods and towards a restaurant. And while Tanya's out and about, I've got a chance to sit down and talk to Naoto without worrying about being overheard by a certain blonde menace. While the tone of his internal monologue was full of affectionate amusement, Ogi was quietly thankful for the chance to sit down with his old friend and speak freely. Tanya's a good kid, but the way she takes things sometimes. That last thought was accompanied by a guilty wince, as Ogi remembered how the girl's Britannian blue eyes had widened in shock and undeniable pain at his poorly considered choice of words. Ogi had somewhat forgotten, in light of her intelligence and successes, that Tanya was still a child, and still undeniably scarred by her experiences at the hands of the Britannians as a result of growing up in Shinjuku. While he doubted that she knew the exact details of her mother's death, a child as smart as Hajime Tanya would certainly have realized that her mother had been killed by Britannians, and that would have made the idea of being Britannian even more unpalatable. The way she'd reeled back when he'd carelessly said that he'd felt like a Britannian while executing her plan had been painful, and the way she'd begun to panic when he said she needed help even more so. The former had been a lapse of judgment, but the later had been a genuine offer of assistance, and seeing her react so poorly to his desire to help her stung. I'll have to make the Brit comment up to her somehow, but I wasn't wrong about her needing help, damn it. It was weird seeing a blonde-haired blue-eyed child dying of karoshi, but the symptoms were clear to Ogi. In a very peculiar way, he reflected, her willingness to obsessively work her way into the grave truly made her Japanese at a level where neither hair nor eye color mattered. Not that they ever did, not to anybody willing to think straight. Anyone who helps our people is Japanese to me. A few thankfully short minutes later, and Ogi was back in the relative warmth of the shared apartment. While by no means toasty, the intact walls and ceiling at the very least kept out the worst of the cold. Naoto was seated at the table, scribbling away at something, but looked up and waved as Ogi entered and pulled his boots off. How was your walk? Did it start sleeting again? Naoto's typically friendly smile, while undoubtedly sincere, looked a tad forced, and Ogi noted that the bottle of cheap homemade sake his friend had cracked open shortly before he'd left was nearly empty already. Thankfully not, there's ice all over everything, though. Hopefully it'll thaw before it rains again. Ogi collapsed into a chair at the table, groaning with satisfaction and relief as his weary feet rejoiced in the break. The haulers are out in force today, though. Looks like they've finally stopped digging around in the old station. Naoto grimaced at that, and shoved the paper and pen away. Ogi caught the pen as it tried to roll off the edge of the table, and out of curiosity stole a quick look at the paper. Naoto's usual fine handwriting, a product of remedial etiquette lessons imparted on a noble black sheep welcomed back to the fold, was sloppy and dense on the page, but it appeared to be a letter to his mother. No wonder he was drinking. He's trying to explain why he let Callan fight. Best of luck with that, buddy. Naoto smiled wanly at Ogi's sympathetic look. She's pissed, bro. If I wasn't already a bastard, I think she'd be demanding my father disinherit me for letting her baby girl get involved. Ogi chuckled weakly, remembering times his high school-aged self had visited the Kozuki residence. Callan hadn't inherited her fiery temper solely from her red-headed father, back before the conquest, and before her mental decline had set in earnest. Miss Kozuki had never concealed the sharper side of her tongue as she chided her rogue of a son and his slacker of a best friend. While he doubted that fearsome temper had survived intact the traumas and degradations of the last half-decade, Ogi was sure that Mama Kozuki had strong words for anybody who led her baby girl into danger. Remembering the danger said baby girl had been led into, Ogi's laughter trailed off, and he let the amusement fall away. Seeing his change in mood, Naoto likewise let his smile drop, and the vague, alcohol-fueled mistiness of his eyes faded slightly as the leader of their cell pulled on his business persona. What do you want to talk about, Ogi? I know that look, spit it out. No time like the present. It's been 2 days since we carried out Tanya's plan. How are you feeling, now that some time's passed? Naoto drummed his fingers on the scarred wood of the table for a second, then again, not a nervous gesture but an old tic he'd had since high school that always returned when he was presented with a tricky question. After a moment, the hand smacked lightly against the table, the fingers' frenetic movements stilled against the surface. Frankly, I'm absolutely astonished that everything worked out so well. Naoto's tone was straightforward, but an undeniable hint of wonder touched his voice as he began. I mean, we both knew Tanya's plenty smart and all that, but when she came up with that plan, I almost laughed at the audacity, Ogi. Decapitating an entire gang through the use of synchronized bombs, and then just running in and shooting everybody who'd somehow survived, all as a means of raising funds for that front charity she set up. Naoto barked a laugh, sharp-edged but appreciative. But then she actually pulled it off. I never would have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. A broad smile pulled its way across Naoto's face as Ogi fervently nodded. It really had been a time when seeing is believing. For better or worse, Tanya had proven that her first time returning to her comrades slick with blood and a truck full of captured supplies hadn't been a fluke. She delivered everything she promised and more, Ogi. Enough ammunition to put at least 2 of those rifles we captured to use, at least for a bit. Enough speed, horse, oxy, and hash, and enough currency to keep the cell supplied for a year, with plenty left over for Rising Sun to keep feeding our people for at least a few more months, and maybe enough to expand past soup kitchens and clothes distribution. Not to mention the absolute destruction of one of the largest gangs in Shinjuku as a fighting force. Naoto's eyes almost seemed to glow with combined wonder and glee, sharpening with satisfaction at the mention of the Kokurokai's fate. I don't even know if the whole gang war that's erupted since then was intentional or not, but with all the gangs at each other's throats, nobody's looking for us, especially not after that purist bastard Kuehl all but publicly claimed responsibility. We got everything we wanted, and still nobody knows we even exist. Ogi waited a moment as Naoto paused, waiting to see if the enthusiastic burst would continue, before asking his next question. Do you have any reservations, regrets, about the mission, or about the plan? Naoto smiled again at that, the earlier broad smile narrowing into a sharper, toothier expression. Nope. At first, I was kinda shocked, never seen something like that before, you know, and it definitely took an extra drink or 3 to get to sleep that night. That said, he paused, seemingly considering what he wanted to say, before continuing. That said, Tanya was absolutely correct about those gangsters. Whatever else they were predators and scavengers, and were helping the Britannians pluck meat from our bones. Maybe that wasn't their intention, maybe they just wanted to make their own lives less miserable, but that's what they were all doing. Fuck 'em. Naoto seemed to realize he'd started leaning in as he'd talked, and pushed back against the table, tipping back slightly on his chair's rear legs, before slamming back forwards with a wry laugh. The only regret I've got is letting Callan go along, but I don't think I'm going to win that fight. Tanya was right about that too. She's part of this, and trying to hold her back isn't going to do her or anybody else any good. I was kinda hoping that seeing all that would, I dunno, make her more interested in being a schoolgirl, but I doubt that's gonna happen. Callan was kinda shocked too, you know, but she's even more of a fighter than I am, and now that she's killed again, and tasted a real victory again, not just winning a street fight, she's not gonna stop, no matter how angry Mom gets. Ogi nodded along, in full agreement with his old friend. The teacher in him quailed at the thought, but the survivor and the rebel nodded their agreement. Making a 15-year-old, a girl he remembered as a bubbly elementary and middle school student who'd loved drawing pictures for her mother, carry a gun and kill in the name of a free Japan was evil, but what was done was done. The teacher was in agreement with the rest of him about the cruelty of children, and the addictive nature of power, and what power was greater than that of holding life or death over the heads of others. When Callan had stabbed the man to death after he'd tried to attack her and Tanya, perhaps there was still a chance for her to walk away from the savage joy of victory, and of killing, but now Ogi was sure that opportunity had passed. The first time's the hardest, but it gets easier. Ogi remembered his own first kill, a desperate business months after the collapse of the Japanese government and all social order, when the Britannians had yet to implement even the scant handful of public health and humanitarian policies they'd later adopt. It had been a fight over the last few cans of food in an emergency shelter, originally designed to shelter survivors in the event of severe earthquakes or typhoons. Ogi had remembered seeing the designated shelter sign over a locked door in a shop in Asakusa in happier days. Half-starved and lacking for any better ideas, Ogi had limped his way there, finding the lock already broken and the door ajar. The confrontation with the man, older and weaker than even his starving body, had been brutal. The only light in that shelter had been the other man's flashlight, swinging crazily and reflecting off the dull steel of Ogi's pipe as he'd brought it down again and again and again, driven by desperate hunger and rage that the old bastard hadn't even been willing to give him a single can of ancient rations to stave off the overwhelming hunger. After that horrible 10 minutes of violence, and after he'd glutted himself on one of the 3 cans of survival rations still left in the shelter, Ogi had curled up a meter away from the corpse and cried himself to sleep. He'd taken what he could carry and left hours later, desperate to get away from the horror he'd perpetrated in that basement shelter, weeping for what he had done and for all that he had lost. The second kill had been far easier, both in execution and justification. Sorry Naoto, but if she hasn't turned back now, she's not going to. I think you're right about that, Naoto. Ogi returned to the topic at hand, externalizing his agreement with his leader's conclusions. Do you resent Tanya for helping Callan down that path? Nope. Naoto's reply was surprisingly fast, nearly overlapping with the end of Ogi's question. Clearly, Ogi thought, he'd been expecting that line of inquiry. Much as I'd like to give in to temptation and shoot the messenger, I'm in charge and I made the call. A moment of drumming, before I can't let myself treat Callan any differently than the rest of the cell, and Tanya was right to back her up. I still think she's way too young for this, but, hey, Tanya said it herself, she's not too young for the Britannians to kill her if they ever learn about just my crimes alone. That somewhat fatalistic assessment left a heavy silent moment behind, before Naoto broke the silence once again. Plus, it's really hard to be angry with Tanya when she's working so hard and still not eating. We've got to figure out a way to get that girl to chill out, Ogi, before shit gets worse. And on that happy, mutually agreed note, their little conference broke up. Naoto returned to his letter, vainly trying to dodge maternal disapproval, as Ogi pulled his boots back on. If he remembered the schedule Tanya had drawn up correctly, Tamaki and Ino should both be at the Rising Suns building today. They'd certainly welcome an extra hand, and there'd be plenty of opportunities for him to talk to each of them on their own during the day. Might even make packing those food packages a bit less tedious. Both of his cellmates lived up to his expectations, both very busy handling the crowd of desperate Japanese looking for extra layers, for extra food, and for able hands that could help batch shattered windows or hold walls. Ino was busy helping people find clothes that would fit various family members, while Tamaki was burning through the prepared stack of food packages, pressing box after box into the arms of gratefully bowing ghetto dwellers. Both were clearly busy, so Ogi put off his intended conversations for the moment and hastily began packing more boxes with food, multivitamins, and chocolate bars for 4 for a day. After hours of fulfilling labor, with aching arms and a sore back, the stream of the desperate and the dispossessed slowly shrank to a more manageable level. The bitter cold of the early winter winds kept all but the most determined huddled around whatever heaters they could fuel or fires they could start, giving Ogi the opportunity to take Tamaki aside for a quick smoke break. The younger man eagerly accepted, jumping on the excuse to get away from the distribution line for a moment, and even more eager to bum a cigarette from Ogi, a Britannian import, not one of the so-called Hafu hand-rolled smokes common in Shinjuku, so-called because they were half trash and half tobacco, or at least half the alleged tobacco smuggled into the ghetto by the various gangs. Ogi obliged, and after giving Tamaki a moment to get his coffin nail lit and going, took the opportunity to ask how his comrade was doing. "Shit's going great, man. Did I tell you about the gym me and a couple of my brothers got set up?" Tamaki's free hand gestured enthusiastically as babbled on. "I mean, it's not really a gym, I guess, not any real equipment or nothing, but it's not too hard to find heavy shit, you know? Shizuo found these pipes, you see, and welded the bottom of each shut, and then we filled each with some sand and welded the other end shut, homemade weights, you see? Perfect for benching and blasting my pecs a bit. Sounds like fun. I'm glad you and your friends managed to get something like that set up." Tamaki's enthusiasm appeared to be just as purely felt as any other emotion the hothead ever felt. "I'm glad there's at least one person who doesn't try to hide their emotions. It's refreshing." Soon, Tamaki's chatter about the improvised gym wound down, and as he took a long puff, Ogi discarded subtlety. Taking a quick look around to check for eavesdroppers and finding none, Ogi leaned in close and asked, "It's been 2 days since our little job. Now that the celebration's over, what do you think about what we did?" Tamaki exhaled a long plume of smoke, quickly snatched away by the damp wind, and smiled at his superior. "It was fucking incredible, wasn't it? I mean, don't get me wrong now, I wish those had all been Brits, would have been a hell of a lot more satisfying to put bullets in Brit heads, I'll tell you that for sure." The younger man paused for another puff, and another long exhale, the fierce joy slowly transmuting into a more pensive mien as the wind snatched away the smoke issuing from his lips. "I think my pops would be proud of us, you know? He was a cop, died back during the conquest. They say he was trying to help get people out of Shinjuku once the Brits started shelling the place, but I dunno about that. Doesn't really matter, I guess. I dunno if he'd be happy about us killing folks, even if they are gangster scum, but I bet he'd be happy we're doing what we can to look out for the good people here in Shinjuku." Ogi nodded along, content to stay quiet and listen. He kept a wary eye open, making sure that none of the men and women walking past their location huddled in the alley beside the rising sun building towards the door and the promise of food and warmth inside looked too interested in them, but nobody seemed interested in 2 men stealing a quick smoke out in the cold. "You know, at first I was kinda unhappy that we were gonna sneak attack the place. I mean, if nobody knows we did it, there's not really any glory, is there? And no glory means no rep, no babes hanging off me and all that." Tamaki chuckled at that, grinding out his butt against the wall before pulling a baggie out his pocket and carefully peeling the paper away, dumping the leftover shreds of tobacco into the bag. "But, well, that was a stupid thought, just a drunk thought. I mean, babes are nice and all that, but this is the real deal now, ain't it? We're not screwing around and robbing shit anymore, this is serious. This is how we're gonna free Japan, Ogi, or at least make the Brit bastards hurt for once." One bloodbath after another. Ogi handed his cigarette butt over to Tamaki, who quickly stripped the surviving tobacco out before flicking the filter away into the alley. "I dunno how many more bloodbaths we're gonna see, Ogi, but I ain't gonna regret a single one, not until the Brits are all gone away." Tamaki tucked the bag away back in his coat, and the 2 men began making their way back into the warmth of the Benevolent Association's building. "I just hope I live long enough to brag to everybody about how many of the bastards I killed along the way. The honeys won't be able to keep their hands away, you'll see." Thankfully, Ogi didn't have to brave the cold of the evening again to buttonhole Inno. As soon as he and Tamaki returned to the open room that made up most of the first floor of the Rising Suns building, Ino immediately grabbed Tamaki and put him back to work before he had the chance to wander off again, chiding him for taking a break without telling her and Ogi for enabling his escape from work. Soon, both men found themselves once more distributing boxes of food to the hungry residents of Shinjuku. A few minutes of ignoring Tamaki moaning about his tragic fate to suffer under such harsh discipline later, Ogi demonstrated his leadership skill by delegating the remaining work to his subordinates' capable hands. Ino was seated at a small, rickety desk in the semi-separate room at the rear of the first floor. Back when the building had been home to an insurance agency, the small room had been some sort of conference room or office, separated from the main room by a glass wall and sliding door. The frame of the first remained, but all the glass was long since shattered, leaving an illusion of separation rather than a truly separate room. This small area housed what could be called the office area of the Rising Sun, including the ledgers describing both donations and donations made to the Benevolent Association, as well as other books tracking purchases made with that money and records tracking how much aid had been distributed to the people of Shinjuku per day, and of what variety the books were, as Ogi knew, best characterized as creative fiction, reasonably close to the truth but full of holes and unexplained transactions that obfuscated both the source of much of the money and expenditures like how much fuel had been purchased for the Rising Sun's rented trucks. As Ogi approached, Ino looked up from the ledger she was transcribing the day's distributions into, and waved Ogi over to a stool on the opposite side of her desk. She looked as put together as always, indigo hair neatly combed and pinned back, a faint furrow on her brow from glaring at ledgers in dim light all day, and grey eyes brimming with a fierce intelligence. While Naoto's leadership had bound the group together and Ogi's social skills had kept the members of the cell on the same page, Naomi Ino's negotiating ability and connections with the various factions and black market operations had kept the cell armed and supplied, albeit with Naoto's money. Tired from hauling boxes and reasoning that any attempt at subtlety would immediately be seen through by the cell's logistics officer, Ogi didn't bother beating around the bush. "Hey, Ino, it's been 2 days. How are you holding up?" "It was very profitable, our mission, and for that I'm glad." Ino leaned back in her chair, ignoring the ominous creaking, and smiled at Ogi. "I'm sure Tanya put you up to this, right? Hey, Ogi, make sure everybody's doing okay and still likes me. That sounds like her." Ogi laughed at that. Apart from him and Naoto, and perhaps of late Kallen, of the cell members Ino had spent the most time with the youngest member of the Kozuki organization. Between familiarizing herself with how business was done in Shinjuku, keeping the Rising Sun operating, and planning out the cell's future expenditures as Danya had planned out her latest and greatest operation, the two of you had spent quite a bit of time together. Unlike any other member of the cell, the blonde had taken to Ino's world like a duck to water, seeming to understand all the lessons the older woman had to teach almost instinctively. While Ogi saw the girl as a promising student, with, if you were being honest with himself, the slightest dash of paternal affection, he was fairly sure that Ino saw her as a protégé who would one day surpass her master. As such, it was unsurprising that she'd recognized Danya's hand behind his movements, although he'd been planning on speaking with the various cell members even before his post-celebration conversation with Danya. Yeah. I mean, I was going to do it anyway, but when a spooky little girl tells you to check up on everybody, you'd be a fool to ignore the warning." The words were light, but Ogi meant them nonetheless. Perhaps by dint of surviving in the ghetto as an obvious and malnourished outsider, Tanya had cultivated an extraordinary degree of empathy, although one that manifested itself in strange ways. At times her behavior was almost overly solicitous about the health and well-being of her fellow comrades, while at others she flinched away from even the most casual touch, eyes wide like a hunted animal. That said, even if Danya's perceptiveness was born of paranoia and thus tainted, Ogi couldn't blame her for it and wouldn't ignore her recommendations. Anybody who had survived 5 years of nice solitary life in Shinjuku, and anybody who could unleash the frighteningly effective violence that always seemed to bubble just beneath that porcelain skin, was well worth listening to. Especially if they were none too subtly warning that your fellows might be on the edge of a post-traumatic psychological break. Ino laughed and nodded. "I get that. Well, you can tell her that I'm fine, whenever you next see her. Those gangsters were a pack of thieving, raping murderers, and I don't regret killing a single one of them. Plus, Thanks to everything we took from that pit, the Rising Sun and our own organization will be adequately funded for some time, so it was absolutely worth a few sleepless nights. The chair's front legs landed back on the floor with a loud thump as Ino straightened back up, ticking points off her fingers. Yeah, I had a few nights of bad sleep. I've never seen something like that before, and seeing that much raw, shredded meat would make me a vegetarian if we had that sort of luxury. Yes, I'm concerned about the civilians who are undoubtedly getting caught in the crossfire of the gang war even now as I'm talking with you, but nobody thought the gangs would just go away peacefully. The logistics officer paused for a moment, before shaking her head with irritation. Honestly, the only things that truly concern me are the impact on the Shinjuku market scene, and Tanya's garbage excuse for a diet. Ogi hummed in agreement. I think I know where you're coming from on the later, but I'm not as sure that I fully understand the former concern. What sort of impact are you expecting our actions are going to have on the black market? We're going to see the death of the middle level of the market, at least for a while. Ino replied bluntly. The family and individual level barterers aren't going anywhere, and the big fish that cater to the Britannians' appetites, her lip curled with disgust and scorn, aren't going anywhere, they're just going to beef up their security. But the weekly meats? Those are done. They're not coming back. Even if the gangs decide a week from now to stop ripping out each other's throats, the stability and organization of the whole structure's been toppled. Ino tapped her cheek with the pen she'd been using before Ogi had walked in, her expression pensive as Ogi carefully listened. This is going to have significant knock-on effects, Ogi, both positive and negative for us. On the negative side for everybody but the Brits, it's gonna sharply reduce any sort of economic activity in the ghetto. The low-level barter economy can't keep up, and once the gangs start smuggling goods back into Shinjuku, they're probably going to pursue more of an individual retail approach, rather than selling things to smaller groups at weekly meets, who turn around and sell the goods to everybody else. Nobody's got the infrastructure to fill that void right now, so everybody's gonna go short-handed. On the plus side for us, that's going to break the gangsters' stranglehold over the market in Shinjuku in the long run, as people find alternative sources for staples and learn to do without everything they can't find. On the negative side specifically for us, it's gonna be a lot harder to buy weapons since somebody blew up a weapons market and killed everybody in attendance. I could go on, but I think you've got the idea. Ogi nodded thoughtfully. Everything Ino said made sense, and in retrospect seemed like the obvious results of a major bombing attack. He wondered why none of these possible effects had occurred to him when he and Naoto had signed off on Tanya's plan. Probably just tunnel vision. We got too focused on if we could do it to wonder what next. Thanks. I'll have to go over all that with Naoto. I know Tanya was talking about trying to increase the quantity of food shipped into Shinjuku, and Suichiro had that chicken idea. But if you're sure that the availability of other goods is going to take a nosedive too, we should see if we can expand our inventory range a bit. Ogi found a doujad scrap of notebook paper that didn't look like it had anything important written on it and started jotting down notes. I'm assuming that medicines are going to be at the top of the list, right? That could be tricky. Buying generics in bulk is probably gonna require some sort of contact, and we won't be able to bring in insulin or anything else that requires special care. Gotta find out who needs what, and how to get people what they need. I've already got something started on that score. Ino reached down into one of the desk drawers and hauled out a folder stuffed full of pages of notes. I've been talking to the people who've been coming in to get food and clothes, and asking them if any of their family members or neighbors have any conditions they need medicine for. Thankfully, Ino's face tightened at the word, but she pressed on. Thankfully, very few people with chronic conditions live long in Shinjuku, so we won't be needing to worry about insulin. While I would like to find some way to get these people the medicines they've been relying on gang imports for, I think we should focus on ramping up the multivitamin supply and increase the amount of antibiotics Rising Sun has in stock, as well as building up a supply of painkillers, although we'll have to be careful about that last one. Anti-inflammatory pills would help relieve some chronic pain, which might increase the number of people who can work, which makes them a priority. And birth control pills, for both reducing period pain and also as contraceptives. Ogi quickly jotted down the list of suggestions as Ino continued. All right, leaving the medication question aside until we find some way to source generics without bankrupting Rising Sun. We've begun buying up some water filtration kits for people to use in their apartments, but we should try to expand that effort. We need to find a way to get more cooking fuel in, since supplies from the gangs are going to be scarcer and more expensive. Coats and blankets, and waterproofing materials. Tearing his mind away from the rabbit hole of all the many needs of the Shinjuku ghetto, Ogi remembered that Ino had expressed a concern beyond the market supply question. Oh, before we get too distracted, wasn't there something else you wanted to talk about? Ino snorted, and shoved the multiple folders of notes she'd begun to pore over back into the desk. Yes, Ogi, there was. Namely how Tanya's apparently trying to work herself into the grave, and how she only eats when prompted to do so. Ino shook her head with annoyance, before glaring at Ogi, who resisted the urge to quail away from the look of righteous fury that pinned him to his stool. You're her fucking adoptive father, Ogi. Why the hell aren't you making her eat and sleep? She already looks half dead, and I swear the only time she eats is when I hand her a sandwich while she's working and she just starts instinctively munching on it. Hey, I'm not her father. Ogi waved his hands frantically in a fruitless attempt to deflect responsibility. And how do you think she's responded to me and Naoto trying to convince her to eat, eh? When Naoto suggested she fatten herself up to look like a Britannian, she stopped considering infiltration work and started planning instead. When I told her she needed to eat to be effective, she looked terrified, like I'd said I was going to kick her out on the street. Aware that his frustration on the issue had begun to spill out into a long-suppressed rant, Ogi forced himself to calm down and take a deep breath. He'd been incredibly uncomfortable about embracing Tanya's role as a combat-capable member of the cell to begin with, and watching her stress herself out and skip meals since she'd been promoted hadn't helped his internal sense of guilt in the slightest. It's not Ino's fault, he firmly reminded himself. She's just as concerned as I am, and yelling at her is unfair and stupid. A second later, Ogi began to speak again, more calmly this time if not the slightest bit less emphatic. We can't order Tanya around like a kid when she's killed more people than everybody else in the cell combined, especially not since she just planned and executed the biggest and most successful operation we've ever attempted. Every attempt Naoto and I have made to convince her through logic has failed. Whenever I seem to express any concern for her in the slightest, she looks like she expects me to hit her. I don't know what to do here, Ino. His comrade sighed, reached across the desk, and patted Ogi on the shoulder. It sounds frustrating, and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have acted like you were just ignoring her. Ino leaned back in her chair again, letting the front legs lift off the floor once more. Maybe you're overthinking it a bit? I mean, I get what you're saying about not being able to order her around like a kid, and you're right to a degree, but maybe you should, in this case? Ogi opened his mouth, before closing it again as Ino gestured for quiet. No, really. I think you guys were absolutely right to take her seriously and treat her as an equal, when it comes to working for the cell. Outside of that sort of work environment, though? I hate to break it to you Ogi, but she's still a kid. Her mom only died. What, 4 months ago? She'll be 12 soon, right? She needs some support, even if she definitely disagree about that. Sit down with her and tell her, in as unambiguous a way as possible, that you're worried for her and that she needs to eat. And then, follow that up by making sure there's always food around her. Whenever I'm working with her, I just leave some food by her, a sandwich or a bowl of soup or whatever, and she'll eat it while she's working. Ogi had spent a fair amount of time deliberately trying to not see Tanya as a child, someone who in another world might have been in his middle school math class. He had partially done this so he'd have less trouble taking her seriously as a comrade, but mostly it had been an effort to ignore the whole child-soldier angle. As a result, while he could see the practicality of accepting Ino's advice, he found himself loath to do so. It's a bit late to have scruples now. You're willing to overlook Tanya's age, not to mention Callan's, when it's beneficial to your goals, but you're not willing to cope with your bullshit enough to make sure they're as healthy and safe as they can be. And you call yourself a responsible adult? Ogi shivered slightly at that thought. No, I don't call myself a responsible adult. I can't. I'm just as fucked up as anyone else. I'm a murderer. I just want to hold on to some degree of sanity, some degree of civilization. But, anything for the cause, right? That's what Tanya said to Callan, according to Naoto, and that's what Callan's taken to saying too. Anything for the cause. You're right. The words were like chalk, and forcing them out felt like it took every ounce of will Ogi possessed. You're right, she is a kid. And she's not eating, and someone needs to step in. Ogi rose to his feet, the exhaustion of physical labor nothing compared to the spiritual exhaustion this conversation had produced. I'll let Naoto know about your suggestions for the Rising Sun's next inventory purchase, and I'll sit down with Tanya over a nice big meal once she gets back from doing whatever she's up to with Callan. Picking up the note he'd taken of their conversation, Ogi carefully tucked it into an inner pocket of his jacket, away from any possible infiltrating sleet. Thanks, Ino. I think that I needed to hear that as much as anything else. Have a good evening now. Waving goodbye to Tamaki as he left, Ogi ventured once more out into the cold. The sun had now almost disappeared behind the skyline, and the day's icy rain was quickly becoming just ice once more on the streets of Shinjuku. Carefully picking his way down the pavement, Ogi made his way back home, trying to marshal his thoughts for the battle of wills to come. Look, I know you're incredibly busy, but you've got to eat. Thus far, the talk had proceeded about as badly as Ogi had feared. He'd returned to the apartment shortly after Tanya had, and found the girl already buried in her work. Ogi had almost given in to the temptation to put off the confrontation in favor of joining her in planning out the cell's next move, and indeed had pulled the notes from his conversation with Ino out with the intention of adding it to the pile of scrawled notes sitting in front of Tanya. Thinking about that note had reminded him of the end of their conversation, and Ogi had felt the iron jaws of responsibility close around his legs. He knew he wouldn't be able to outrun the stressful social situation no matter what he tried, and so decided to take the direct approach. From across the table, big blue eyes narrowed at him as Tanya looked up from her papers. Naoto said he'd be back soon. I thought it would be prudent to wait until he'd returned to have dinner. Resisting the urge to take the out she'd offered, Ogi firmed his resolve and leaned forward. I'm not talking about dinner specifically, I'm talking about in general. You've been skipping meals, and you only eat when someone else prompts you. Don't think I haven't noticed how you've been waking up with the sun to start working early too. The curiosity in Tanya's eyes hardened into defensiveness, and Ogi internally kicked himself. Damn it, too aggressive. Now she's going to start justifying herself. It's important to work hard, not only for ourselves but for everybody in Shinjuku. Tanya's tone was cool, and at one point Ogi would have said detached as well. Months of familiarity, coupled with his own experience dealing with recalcitrant children, let Ogi recognize the shaky tone of fear concealed by the cold tone. She's desperate to prove herself, to be the most diligent and committed. Why? Does she think we'll look down on her otherwise? It was a silly assumption, if true, but one that made a degree of sense. The poor girl didn't get much support from her mother, from what she's let slip. She probably feels the need to prove herself so we don't ignore her too. She wants attention? No, that's not it. You're right. Ogi was slightly gratified to see her eyes widen, momentary surprise at his agreement shaking her defensiveness. Attacking her certainties isn't the right way to go. I'm not trying to tear her down, I'm trying to help her. The people of Shinjuku, and the rest of Japan, do need our help. And you're doing lots of very important, very impressive things to help them. You're a big help. Ladle on the encouragement, let her know that her efforts have been noticed and appreciated. And if you want to keep helping people, you need to help yourself. Don't tell her that she's been doing anything wrong, just give her help to grow in the right direction. I know Naoto told you about the potential benefits of looking more Britannian, but I know that idea's got some baggage associated with it. In that case, let me put it this way, if you eat more, your muscles will develop better and your bones will be stronger, which will reduce the likelihood of injury and will improve your level of energy. Being more energetic will keep your genius brain working as best as it can, and it'll reduce the chance of you overlooking something or making a mistake. Her abilities and intelligence are important to her, clearly. Confirm her own self-image, but indicate a path to further achievement. Plus, you want to hang out with Callan in the Britannian concessions sometimes, right? Ogi smiled, letting his firm teacher face mellow, and winked at the impassive Tanya. Increased growth potential and stability in her own image are both carrots, but she's also a social animal, and an extra incentive never hurts anything. If you want to go and reconnoiter the Tokyo settlement, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to be on duty all the time, and the Britannians would never expect two pretty young girls having fun at Clove Island to be terrorists. But if you look like you're about to keel over, that's gonna attract some notice, right? Plus, people might assume you're Callan's servant, and she's been mistreating you, and you don't want to draw attention to her, yeah? A cautious nod was the only immediate external response Ogi got, but he thought he saw her eyes turn thoughtful. I know you, Tanya. You overthink everything, and it's incredibly frustrating. Well, two can play that game. But now that she's thinking about it, time to give her a route forward before she gets creative and proposes her own. Look, you're a smart girl, so I'm sure I don't need to tell you all of this. Ogi paused for a moment to let the praise settle, before continuing. But we all need help sometimes, and as your superior in the cell and as your friend, I'm going to help you too. You and I are going to eat together for the next 2 weeks, at least 2 meals a day, hopefully 3. You can keep working while we eat, if you want, but we're going to get you back into the habit of regular meals. After that, I'll stop nagging you to eat if you keep it up, okay? For a moment, Ogi was sure that Tanya was about to either hit him or attempt an escape. Her fists tightened around her pen and her jaw worked furiously, chewing away at nothing as her eyes darted around the room. Finally, with a grudging sigh, her hands loosened and her shoulders slumped. Her eyes seemed to suddenly flatten, and she looked down at the table. As you command, sir. Ogi felt his own hand twitch with sudden anger at both himself and Tanya's seemingly almost deliberate attempt to misunderstand what he was trying to say and do. Damn it, Tanya, I'm trying to help you. Can't you see that? I'm not trying to control you, I'm not trying to put you in your place. I just want you to take care of yourself. Keeping his own jaw firmly locked, Ogi took in one long, deep, soothing breath through his nose, and then another. Tanya, I just don't want to see you work yourself to death. I respect you, Tanya, you're far more intelligent than I am, and you've already survived so much. You're already an incredible fighter, and you're well on your way to being an awesome leader. Please believe me when I tell you that I am not trying to humiliate you or make you submit or whatever. I'm concerned about you, and I want you to take care of yourself. Ogi suddenly felt like he had plunged through some hole in the floor, and was now free-falling. Being this open about his emotions, especially with a child, felt uncomfortable, especially since he'd put his foot in his mouth the last time he'd attempted sincerity. That said, Kaname Ogi couldn't see any other option other than sincerity to convince Tanya that he said what he meant. Her fiendish mind would see through any subterfuge, and any attempt at coercion would be beyond useless. You'll go far, if the Britannians don't get you or you don't burn yourself out. Japan will need people like you, people with intelligence, vision, and experience, to lead us all in rebuilding ourselves when we are finally free once more. Japan needs you alive far more than she needs a martyr, and we need you, Hajime Tanya, alive too. Not just because of your raw ability, we need you for you. You've earned your position as one of us many times over, so let us help you too, just like you've helped us, okay? It's not a crime to need help. Everybody needs some help sometimes, and I want to help you when you need it. Tanya neither moved nor visibly reacted, and Ogi sighed once again. Another fuck up. I screwed up somewhere along the way. Damn it. Ogi started to get up from his seat. He knew a lost cause when he saw one, and at least he could get dinner started for the first of their enforced shared meals. Before he could do more than shift in his seat, he faintly heard a whisper, and immediately stopped. Sorry, Tanya, I didn't hear you. Thank you, Ogi. Her voice was louder, but Tanya's tone still sounded wispy, insubstantial, quite different from her usually assured and confident presentation. Acknowledgement, even tenuous, even perhaps forced. Time to stop while I'm ahead so I don't look like I'm rubbing her nose in this defeat. You're welcome, Tanya. By the time Nato returned with a sack full of canned sardines and 3 fresh oranges of mysterious providence, the latter a luxury in early winter, the pot on the hot plate was bubbling merrily, and the aromatic smell of canned beef stew had filled the apartment. Tanya was already deep into her first bowl, and Ogi was content with a minor victory that banished the memory of the haulers and their grim cargo away. For the first time in weeks, he was sure he'd actually gotten Tanya to understand something he had said completely unambiguously. A minor victory, but hopefully the path to something far more substantial in the future. The clock was striking 13 as Kallenstadt felt neatly settled into her assigned seat during her study hall period. Every move as she folded herself down onto the cushioned chair was done just so, skirt neatly arranged over properly positioned legs, hands carefully folded demurely in her lap in perfect accordance with the etiquette lessons pounded into her head after her father had officially adopted her as his heir. The room was warm and airy, the overhead lights perfectly moderated to maintain a gentle luminescent glow ideal for contemplating one's homework. The entire artifice of the classroom was a world apart from the coldly gusting wind driving fat droplets of rain into the windows. Callan also felt a world apart from the introduction to physics textbook open on the desk in front of her, a diagram of a spring scale with carefully drawn vectors ignored completely. Around her, the other young lords and ladies of the student body gossiped, chatted, and flirted with abandon, textbooks and homework alike lying ignored on their desks as well. But even that superficial similarity seemed to separate her from her peers. None of them, the youngest Kozuki was sure, had walked through an abattoir of humanity, had heard half-flayed and disemboweled men whimper for water, for their mothers, or simply moan in unfathomable pain. The memory of those staring eyes, pupils contracted to pinpoints even in the near darkness of the decaying train station, nearly made Callan flinch from the memory, but grimly she pursued the images of that slaughter, refusing to let even a single detail slip away into the darkness of the tunnels. She threw the memory of pointing the pistol her friend Tanya had handed her earlier that day at supine figures at herself again and again. The first one she'd killed had been little more than Hamburger, missing his right arm completely and his legs from the knees down. In all likelihood, he'd only been a bit older than herself, probably younger than Tamaki, the youngest of her brother's friends. Callan desperately wanted to recoil from the memory, to cram every second of the 15 minutes or so that it had taken to end over 100 human lives deep into her memory to never be thought of again. She'd tried to do just that with her first kill, with the sensation of driving a knife into his neck as hard as she could. Ultimately, not only had that attempt to simply run from the memory failed, Callan had realized it was a weakness that would come back to haunt her. When she'd smelled the blood and seen the bodies on that platform, that memory and all the emotions connected to it had flooded back in, the sensory cues and the adrenaline from running and gunning her way down into the station blowing away every attempt at suppression and leaving her pale and shaking. Her big bro's embrace had reassured her, cradled her in a warmth she had desperately needed in that moment, but it hadn't drawn her out of that stunned state. Only Tanya's voice, as stable and as compelling as it had been on that filthy side street, had anchored her to the present and forced her to keep moving. And moved Callan had, joining her comrades in executing the wounded and cramming her pack with anything of value she could find. That day, in the darkness and dust of that platform, she had truly been sealed to her new comrades, and had drawn strength from the new bond she had formed with everybody there, even the two newcomers she'd only met that day. All of them had come out of that station with hands red and dripping, if only metaphorically. All of them had dipped their daggers, and been sealed together by a shared experience intimate in a way she was only beginning to grasp. The guilt had faded quickly as she drew on both her brothers and her friends' words. Their actions were unquestionably righteous, blessed by the gods of their ancestors and by the glorious cause they fought for. All whom they had killed had been scavengers and parasites, rapists and thieves, and all were willing to trade weapons for any who offered the coin, even if the hand offering the coin was sworn to the throne in Pendragon. What had haunted Callan after the attack had been how easy it had all seemed, and how good it had felt. She knew intellectually that the ease of the attack was due to the careful plans Tanya had drawn up and all the legwork and preparations her cellmates had carried out, and that they'd had the element of surprise on their hands. Coupled with Tanya's insane levels of skill with her pistol, Tamaki and her barely keeping up with the tiny blonde, it perhaps wasn't a surprise that the stunned and disorganized survivors of the pipe bomb blasts hadn't had a chance. It had still felt too easy, though, and killing those survivors had felt almost intoxicating. The knowledge that a simple squeeze of her finger, a slight push against her palm, and a life was snuffed out. The powerful sensation as she had pointed her gun at the young triple amputee weeping on the platform. It had felt nearly godlike. If that's what it feels like. So different from my first time. I can see why the Britannians are always so eager to murder more Japanese. That had been what had disturbed Callan, why she'd had difficulty sleeping of late and trouble keeping her mind on her classes or on her task of gathering intelligence. The knowledge of that high, that drug. Since she had tasted that forbidden fruit, Callan had flogged herself with the memory, The sensation, over and over again, chastising herself with the knowledge that it was wrong to feel like that it was one thing to kill but another entirely to enjoy it. Cursed blood. That has to be it. My mother's Japanese, but my father's Britannian. Now that my hands are as red as our hair, I wonder if he'd still love me? It was his blood, after all, that made me like this, I'm sure. Her outing with Tanya 2 days ago had helped settle Callan's troubled mind down just a bit. Going out together for a nice day in the Britannian concession and just doing normal things together had helped settle her frenzied mind, and had helped her remember just what normality was. Sure, they were checking the prices of water filtration devices and warm sleeping bags, of bulk bottles of aspirin and of cheap yet serviceable shoes, all for the rising sun's future purchases, but they'd done normal stuff too. She'd managed to haul Tanya into a department store to try on some new clothes, but Tanya had only let her buy her a pair of grey canvas pants and a black down jacket, plus some fresh socks and underwear. Decidedly not cute, but Callan could concede their practicality for walking around in Shinjuku without drawing unwanted attention. After their brief clothes shopping trip, Callan had bribed Tanya out of her sulk with a quick trip to a crepe store she'd discovered a few weeks earlier on her way back home from Ashford. After promising to pay for everything, Callan had pressed her advantage as the sponsor of the trip and had bullied Tanya into ordering a particularly large crepe, full of fruit and whipped cream, with hazelnut spread on the interior of the pastry and chocolate syrup drizzled over the cream. It had taken some doing to get the damned waif to accept the crepe, but once she'd started to dig in, it had been remarkable how fast Tanya had destroyed the crepe. The look of pure blissful satisfaction as she'd reclined in her chair like a sated lion had made the expenditure and the effort entirely worthwhile, in Callan's book. Smiling faintly from the memory of a sleepy Tanya, face smeared with whipped cream, Callan pulled herself back into the present. Her information-gathering efforts had already yielded fruit when she dug up Kuehl's Sosai's name and connections with the purist faction. That tidbit had been seamlessly incorporated into Tanya's plan to sow chaos and disorder between the gangs and the Britannians, and between the competing factions in the Area 11 administration, and the squabbles that Lord Kuehl's press conference had kicked off continued, with statements from both sides of the dispute mysteriously leaking to the press, who published the patshots with barely concealed glee. The Shinjuku bombing had become a minor scandal to one side and a symbol of victory to the other. And as the Britannians snapped at each other, nobody seemed to notice or care about anything actually happening in the ghetto. Just as planned. Now that Callan had a definite victory under her belt, a sign that her efforts to gather intelligence from the careless lips of the Ashford student body were worthwhile, it was time to expand her operation. Up until now, she'd simply wandered the halls of Ashford, flitting like a proper social butterfly from engagement to engagement. This was all well and good, as it made her a known and welcome quantity at any number of social engagements with any number of social groups among the students, but it also made it difficult to dig or to show interest without tipping her hand. As a social butterfly she was innocuous, but it also only gave her a cursory amount of information about any one topic before the flow of conversation moved on. Such surface-level intelligence was useful for garnishes like pinning the responsibility for the bombing on Kuehl, Callan thought, but very little beyond that. The question, then, wasn't whether or not Callan should plunge herself deeper into the social scene of Ashford Academy, but how she should do so. Millie Ashford, granddaughter of the principal and pain in Callan's ass, had casually mentioned months ago how she had free access to the school administration's records, a freedom that she freely abused to discover the personal details of students that caught her eye. Unfortunately, attempts to get said details out of the infuriating girl had proven fruitless. Callan didn't know what game they were playing, nor the rules, but she was certain that Millie held the high score and was simply toying with her. It was an infuriating situation for a number of reasons, but Callan couldn't figure out any way to lever the former heiress's secrets out. She had considered simply abandoning the social game, cease trying to win Millie's friendship, and simply breaking into the school office and going through the records herself, but Callan had regretfully abandoned that idea almost immediately. Who knew what kind of surveillance was operating in Ashford, or what kind of security forces would respond to a potential burglar? If she was caught in the act, her life as Callan Stadtfeld would be over, and her background would be carefully examined. Nato would surely be brought in, and it was all downhill from there after that. Another potential strategy would be cozying up with the other notable gossips around the school. Like any high school, and doubly so for a place crammed with the cream of the local good and great, There was no shortage of gossip mongers, and some were so well informed and sought after to be practical queens of the school, or at the very least duchesses, as none contested Millie's dominance over the student body. Callan had considered attempting to ingratiate herself with one of these social power brokers, but had quickly discarded that idea as well. Such a strategy had all the same drawbacks as dealing with Millie. Furthermore, the only way to buy her way into such social circles was if Callan had particularly choice morsels of gossip to offer. Since all of the morsels she had that might be considered interesting were in some way tied to her rebel cell's interests, Callan thought it would be a very bad idea to let anybody know exactly what information she had been collecting. Besides, people as socially savvy as those gossips certainly would realize what sort of information Callan was looking for, which was another way her secret life could end up exposed. And so, just like her fantasy of burglarizing the school office, Callan dismissed that idea as well. After dismissing her first two ideas, Callan was left with her third idea, the safest by far of the three so far. She hadn't committed to any particular extracurricular activities, despite Millie's chiding to get engaged and meet some cute boys, or girls. Reluctant as Callan was to go along with any suggestions from that particular blonde, joining an extracurricular organization would give her an excuse to snoop and probe, if she could hide behind the purposes of her chosen club. In that light, either the yearbook club or the student newspaper would serve her purposes. The yearbook club was constantly watching the student body, constantly snapping pictures, while the student newspaper under Millie's reign had a practically free hand to interrogate any student they desired, so long as they wrote sufficiently entertaining stories. Of the two options, the student newspaper was definitely the preferable choice. In between investigating whatever inane stories she was tasked with, Callan would have plenty of options to follow up on any tasty morsel some fool let slip, all in the name of journalistic rigor. Soon, the bell indicating the end of Callan's study hall period rang, heralding the start of her brief window of lunchtime freedom. Sandwich in hand, Callan made a beeline to the office of the faculty advisor in charge of the newspaper, and caught the man before he'd left his office for his own lunch. It was the work of 3 minutes to sign up for the newspaper club, complete with a handshake from the amused teacher as he ushered her back out of his office so he could lock up. To Callan's mingled surprise and annoyance, Millie Ashford was waiting for her outside the teacher's office, her smirking smile as broad as ever as she casually leaned against the far wall. "How'd you find me here?" Callan couldn't help herself, the surprise loosening her tongue just long enough for her annoyance to take control. Immediately, she snapped her mouth shut, blushing at the momentary lapses that infuriating bitch. Millie chuckled, a demure hand to her mouth somehow making her laughing face even more intensely irritating than her typical smirk. "Oh, a little bird told me a certain redhead was sneaking into a teacher's office for a lunchtime rendezvous." To Callan's disbelief, one of Millie's eyes closed in a lascivious wink, and that awful smile seemed to grow somehow more eminently punchable. Callan quickly looked around for the teacher, hoping he'd been close enough to hear the comment and take the other girl to task for her insinuation, but the educator had clearly known what was good for him and was power walking away down the hall. The useless bastard. "Congrats on finally signing up for some extracurriculars. It's good for us girls to get used to taking on a hefty, meaty schedule, don't you agree?" Cursing her blushing cheeks, Callan resigned herself to enduring another conversation with Millie, and fervently hoped for an opportunity to escape. Millie, for her part, looked like she was enjoying every drop of Callan's embarrassment, an inquisitive eyebrow raised over a nakedly amorous grin. "I know you've been toying around with the possibility for a while, Callan, but as your friend, I'm happy to see you stretch yourself out a bit." Callan felt helplessly at sea, totally out of control of the conversation. The embarrassment at Millie's crass sayings fed her desire to once again taste that power of being the one dishing out the pain, which slammed up against the need for self-control. "Why is she messing with me like this, damn it? Doesn't she know how furious it makes me?" The internal whining was surprisingly helpful. As Callan attempted to answer her own question and ignore the increasingly explicit teasing, she realized that this whole encounter was by no means accidental. Millie had somehow known where Callan was going quickly enough to position herself outside the office, and hadn't shown any signs of being out of breath. "Either she followed me here, or somehow she's keeping close enough tabs on my movements to know where I am at all times. She's trying to keep me distracted and off balance so I don't think about that." The embarrassment remained, at least on the surface level, but the heated rage brewing in Callan's belly disappeared as the ice water realization swept through her. I don't even know why she wanted me off balance, or why she bothered to show herself at all. Is this some kind of weird dominance play? Callan found that she really was beginning to hate Millie Ashford personally, not just as a symbol of the youth of the Britannian ruling class. The way Millie ground her overwhelming social dominance in Callan's face, the way she not only effortlessly ran rings around her but also made sure Callan knew she was toying with her, the constant sexual harassment, the way she kept dropping hints that she knew more about Callan than Callan wanted her to know. Every interaction she had with the fallen noble made Callan hate her slightly more. In a small, petty way, she felt like Millie represented every bit of Britannia's self-proclaimed supremacy, and couldn't help but feel like one of the tanks of the long-dead Japanese army, helplessly trying to keep up with the nightmare that danced around her, always just barely ahead of her tracking cannon. She's got to go. The thought bubbled up from somewhere deep in Callan's mind, deliciously seductive and poisonous. The idea of shutting up that constantly mocking face once and for all with a knife up through the soft meat behind the chin, up through the soft palate at the back of the mouth. She knows too much about you, probably. She's going to hand you over to the authorities, and once you break, they'll haul Naoto, Mom, Dad, Ogi, and Tanya in too. Being honest, Callan had no idea what Millie knew, but she definitely knew that giving in to the urge to murder would certainly end up with her behind bars or, if she was lucky, dead herself. Not now. Not now. She'd take the bullying and taunting a while longer, Callan decided. Anything for the cause. It's part of your sacrifice for Japan too, isn't it? Callan stuttered out some excuse, turned on her heel, and fled, running away from temptation and from the mocking laughter that echoed after her. She so desperately wanted to do to Millie what she had to the last person who had held her down and tried to force themselves on her, but she couldn't, not here and not now. She knew she was making a mistake. Running away like this, running from bullies always made them more hungry to hunt you down, like the predators they were. Despite Naoto's best efforts, Callan had learned that lesson in the dark years between the conquest and when their father had reclaimed them. That must be what Millie knows. Just like all those other Brit bastards, the half-breed is a fun target. Almost better than an 11, since 11s are just animals, but half-breeds are close enough to human to be fun. After school, Callan had her first meeting with the student paper's staff. It was a fairly informal group, and after her introduction she practically vanished into the woodwork as the other members fought over potential stories and assignments. The editor, the head of the club, handled out assignments with the same air as a queen on her throne, bestowing favors to favorites, and hurling the scraps to the rest. Eventually, as the feeding frenzy died down, Callan found herself tasked with investigating a potential haunting, of all things. Apparently, a ghost had been seen darting in and out of the student council's clubhouse at night, and that qualified as a news story worth investigating. Who had reported this apparition was a mystery, as was the reason why they were out and about on the campus and outside the dorms some students live in, but nobody else had been interested in pursuing this story. Some had said they didn't want to waste their time on silly fantasies, others said it was too creepy for them. Callan personally believed that nobody wanted to have to come back to school in the middle of the night, and so she as the new girl had been stuck with the unenviable ghost hunt. Callan saw the assignment in a different light, of course. Not only would it give her a night guaranteed to be free of her stepmother, but Millie was part of the student council, the president. As a matter of fact, anything that Millie was involved in almost certainly had access to private information regarding the student body, and the fact that the student council apparently had an entire building all to themselves virtually guaranteed that there'd be something worth her time in that building. The whole ghost story gave her an excuse to linger around the place late at night, when nobody else would be around, not to mention a reason to poke her nose anywhere she wanted because she saw something over there. Since the student council clubhouse was locked at night to prevent any skullduggery not explicitly authorized by Millie Ashford herself, the first step in Callan's assignment was hunting down a student council member to give her the key. Fortunately, the secretary of the student council was an avid member of the swim club, and thus easily found. Shirley Furnett proved to be a gregarious, easygoing girl who was happy to meet the newest member of the student paper's staff. She had also proven to be a remarkably easily spooked person who went white as a sheet at the first mention of a ghost haunting the clubhouse, and who had practically torn her locker open in her haste to throw her key to the building at Callan. After a polite thank you and a personal promise to get to the bottom of the alleged haunting, which she was sure was nothing but silliness, Callan found herself in the possession of both a key to the student council clubhouse and a surprisingly stern admonition to stay on the first floor and not try to access the second floor. Apparently, it was totes off limits. Don't even think about going up there, Kay? A second personal promise later, and Callan had both the means to access the student council clubhouse and an excellent idea of the first place she should check for her ghost. By 10 o'clock that night, Callan was inside the opulent interior of the student council's pocket kingdom. Even by the standards of a noble girl, accustomed to the rococo of Stadtfeld Manor, the first floor of the council building was richly appointed. Callan even felt vaguely guilty about dripping rain on the deep plush carpet, ludicrous though the feeling was. Why the hell does the student council need a goddamned mini-mansion? Her recent excursion with Tanya had given Callan a keen understanding of how much money it took to keep people alive at a subsistence level, which made the ridiculous finery even more aggravating. The fucking carpet alone could probably feed 100 Japanese for days. Forcing the thoughts of starving Japanese families out of her mind with almost practiced ease, Callan began dutifully snapping pictures of the admittedly gorgeous interior on her student paper-issued camera, doing her best to capture anything that looked remotely spooky under the automatically activated lights. Unfortunately, the true horror of the place couldn't exactly be captured on film, so Callan simply contented herself with taking pictures of the more unusual decorations, including a remarkably badly taxidermied peacock that had apparently been mounted by Reuben Ashford himself, explaining its presence in the formal receiving room. What she didn't find were any computers or suspicious file cabinets crammed to the brim with blackmail material, much to Callan's dismay. As she meandered about the first floor snapping the occasional picture, Callan noted any visible security cameras as well as any way up to the second floor. She discovered a total of 4 ways up the broad, formal staircase up to the second floor foyer, a pair of elevators at either end of the building, and a locked door at the rear of the building with a small unobtrusive stairway icon. Callan also noticed that there were plenty of visible security cameras in virtually every room in the clubhouse, but oddly enough none were around either of the elevators or the mysterious back staircase. So whoever set up the security system here decided to actually conceal the cameras in those areas, meaning they're the only important part of this whole heap. Callan mulled her options over as she continued to snap pictures of any shadow that crossed her rangefinder, before deciding that her new role as a rookie journalist would be plenty to explain away a bit of ill-mannered nosiness. Keeping up her meandering path, she slowly made her way back to the mysterious locked door with the stairway icon, finally coming to a halt and snapping a final picture of the pale wood door. Audacity, always audacity, and journalistic privilege. Callan pulled a hairpin and a nail clipper from the pocket of her uniform blazer, and started fiddling with the door lock, completely aware that the unseen cameras and whoever was behind them were watching her. I'll just tell them I saw the ghost phase through the door. What are they going to do, expel me? The dimly remembered lessons from her big bro proved more than enough to beat the flimsy single tumbler door lock, and soon a distinctive click echoed through the empty hall. With a sigh of relief, Callan returned her tools to her pocket and tried the door. The handle turned easily, but the door remained stubbornly closed. Examining it more carefully, Callan realized that the lock built into the door's handle was nothing compared to the solid 3-inch bar of waist-height steel she could barely make out in the narrow gap between the door and the frame. There was no obvious opening mechanism on this side of the door, and Callan suspected that it was a maglock, which would require the precise movements of a magnet over a specific patch of the door to unlock. Her father had a similar mechanism installed on the door to his study, although certainly not such a substantial model. The door itself was on close examination only paneled with wood. The echo and weight of the thing indicated that something substantially stronger was under the tasteful facade. Whatever's up on the second floor, someone's really serious about keeping it under wraps. Presumably the Ashfords. Fuck, another secret I need to get out of Millie, somehow. Stowing her camera, Callan decided to call the night a bust and headed back out into the rain, uninterested in meeting whoever might be keeping an eye on the cameras. If someone was protecting something that seriously, she doubted they'd be interested in her claims of journalistic freedom. But that means that whatever's behind there is definitely worth further investigation. If they're willing to let all this wealth be guarded by a single lock. Whatever's up on the second floor would definitely interest Tanya. The first Friday of December started pleasantly enough, Though it was wet and cold outside, in the small studio I shared with Ogi and Naoto it was warm and dry. Yesterday's rice, combined with a can of condensed milk purchased during an excursion to the grocery stores of the Tokyo settlement, sat cooling on the now deactivated hot plate as I dug into my bowl of rice pudding. I dimly remembered it from the childhood of my long-ago first life, when my grandmother had made it as a special treat whenever her only grandson came to visit her. Thanks to Callan's access to the Britannian equivalent of the internet, it hadn't been too hard to find a one-pot recipe for rice pudding, and now that I had the money to buy some good ingredients and the time to enjoy my food, I saw no reason to not indulge myself just a bit. It wasn't the same, of course, as some old family recipe lovingly perfected over the generations, but still tasted like a return to childhood. After eagerly spooning another bite into my mouth, I grabbed the orange sitting by my bowl and started peeling it. After watching me burn through the oranges I'd brought back from my first trip with Callan to a Britannian grocery store, Naoto had ensured that there were always oranges waiting for me in the apartment. At first, I'd been a bit hesitant to take advantage of my sudden access to citrus fruit. After years of hard living and watery miso, it seemed like an unimaginable luxury to have fresh fruit on demand. Coupled with the coffee I'd purchased during that same trip to the grocery store, it felt like an almost decadent level of comfort, a degree of indulgence that would isolate us from our neighbors. Fortunately, nobody had tried to rob us, and the other denizens of the apartment building were just as alternatively friendly or standoffish as ever, depending on the neighbor in question. I suspected Ogi's generally well-liked persona as a kindly teacher had done a great deal to soften any resentment. After all, that persona's not entirely fabricated. Maybe they're hoping he'll share with them? The teacher in question sat across the table from me, a summer sausage on a cutting board in front of him, slicing thin medallions from the sausage and popping them into his mouth sandwiched between crackers. I'd given him both items after returning from my most recent trip outside Shinjuku as a small token of thanks, as well as to give him something to eat during our shared meals that wasn't soup. Whatever other virtues the man had, I couldn't abide the way he loudly slurped soup, and if we were going to share meals I was determined that as few of those meals as possible would involve soups, stews, or other broth-based foods. It was quickly becoming clear that I'd been at least somewhat off base in my initial estimation of Ogi's character, particularly in light of the heart-to-heart conversation we'd had about my dietary habits. To my shame, he had seen far more clearly than I had that my previous work-life balance was wildly unbalanced, and that I had been letting myself go. It had been a shock when he'd bluntly informed me that he'd be enforcing a more balanced daily routine, and for a brief moment I'd been resentful of the encroachment onto my personal autonomy, but that had only been the immediate knee-jerk reaction. Before I could even fully sort out the logic behind his sudden intervention, he'd uncharacteristically just opened up. The emotional deluge that followed had been stunning in the extreme, but also deeply affirmational. My work had been noticed, and my worth had been seen and appreciated. Even better, Ogi didn't see me as a charity case or as the abnormality and near-basket case I knew myself to be, as I had feared when he'd told me I needed help. He saw me as a comrade who needed assistance. How could I deny that I needed help, when I'd let myself waste away as I'd stressed endlessly over the operations of the Kozuki organization and the Rising Sun Association? How could I deny his help, when I'd made it a point in the past to help out my comrades when and where I could? If I wasn't willing to accept help, could I really call myself part of the organization? I'd told Naoto that Callan would only be fully accepted as one of us if she shared the risks, and in the sharing of those risks, in running onto that dark subway platform with us, gun in hand, I'd been proven correct. Sitting at the table with Ogi, listening to his impassioned plea to let him help me, I'd realized that this was a risk too that I had to share with the people I depended on to get me into a cushy job after the war. Letting Ogi tell me when I was wrong, when I was hurting myself without helping our people, and accepting help from my fellow terrorists. That was part of being a member of a tightly knit organization. It wasn't a weakness to accept help when one needed it. After all, the Japanese weren't weak when they accepted my help, they were hungry. And I was hungry too. And so, as I peeled my orange and watched Ogi carve slices off the preserved meat, I continued to work on reconstructing my mental model of the man. He was intelligent, but not shockingly so. He was charismatic, but not in the same captivating way Naoto was. He was essentially a leader of the everyman, more approachable and personable than Naoto, and usually entirely able to deal with any minor problem or concern. He was a capable killer who had no qualms nor concerns when I'd laid out my plan for depopulating a train station, but he'd also been entirely willing, eager, even, to help out the other members of the organization deal with their own concerns after the battle. Overall, while he was many things, it seemed increasingly unlikely that a sadist was one of them. I recognized that this could be some sort of elaborate deception that Ogi was playing on me, that he was indeed just as monstrous as I'd suspected, simply with a far better mask than I'd ever anticipated. I also recognized that train of thought led to insanity, and that being overly paranoid was at least as dangerous to my continued survival and membership in the organization as being overly secure in my current sense of success. Ogi's insistence that I actually sit down with him and eat a minimum of 2 meals per day had proven to be an unexpected masterstroke. Being mandated to carve out time in my schedule for said meals had been a bit of an inconvenience, until I realized that I could take as long as I wanted to sit and eat and unwind and not be accused of shirking. After all, since the breaks were the product of my direct superior and roommate, nobody was going to chide me for simply relaxing for a few precious minutes instead of working through my lunch hour. Beyond the sudden freedom to eat in peace, spending the required time with Ogi had forced me to get over the initial awkwardness I had felt after that conversation. Sitting in chilly silence would have been decidedly uncomfortable, after all, and probably wouldn't have reassured him that I would continue to eat regularly into the future after my period of supervision ended. Plus, it would have gone against the clear spirit of the order, namely to work on actually forming mutual relationships with my comrades instead of just bossing them around all the time. Looking back on it, between the large, regular, relaxing meals, the casual chatter that usually accompanied said meals, and the multiple trips I'd taken with Callan into the Britannian concession, the last week had been unexpectedly pleasant. Now that Callan was well and truly a full-blooded member of the organization, she was proving to be an incredibly diligent worker. Only a day after my uncomfortably emotional conversation with Ogi, I'd found myself in a camping goods store, comparing the price and quality of a wide range of potentially useful gadgets. We'd gone down a wish list of goods provided by Inno, investigating thermal underwear and warm sleeping bags before making our way to the display of water filtration devices. Down the list we'd gone, debating the relative thicknesses of fabric and the price per replacement filter in quiet Britannian, Callan correcting my pronunciation as we went. We'd ended up leaving the store without making any purchases, but with a wealth of information to direct future purchases by the rising sun, and with my Britannian ever so slightly improved. Looking for new opportunities to practice my rusty Britannian and to shake the lingering traces of the Empire from my words, I followed Callan into the department store, even permitting her to hold my hand as we made our way through the lobby and up the stairs so we wouldn't be parted in the throng of eager consumers, chatting about trivial things as we went. I'd found myself so engaged in our conversation about the latest Ashford Academy gossip that I hadn't even noticed our destination until we'd arrived at the junior miss section, and it was only then that I realized how the school chatter had begun to bend towards the current wintertime trends over the last few minutes. I saw the eager gleam in Callan's eyes and resigned myself to my fate, deciding that if being dolled up for the older girls' amusement was the price of the language practice, I'd pay that price. Fortunately, Callan might have been a noble, but she had no more love for frills and fancy dresses than I had, and all of the outfits she proposed were at least free of skirts. Thought I had to put my foot down when she'd offered me a pair of short shorts that didn't go further than my mid-thigh. I'd known from seeing Callan's outfits, including her school uniform, that the Britannians were decidedly more liberal when it came to coverage than either the Imperials of my past life or the Japanese of my current time, but I wasn't so impressed by Callan's fashion sense to let her bully me into tiny shorts and leg warmers. Fortunately, pleading the necessity of blending into the Shinjuku crowd had convinced her where concerns about the cold had failed, and the ridiculous shorts were returned to their rack in peace. In the end, I'd ended up richer by a pair of nice hard-wearing pants and a warm jacket in comfortingly bland colors. Remembering the hard-earned lessons of my past, I also took the opportunity to pick up new socks and underwear. Dry socks were more valuable than gold on the front. I'd seen multiple men succumb to heinous cases of trench foot and other fungal infections after prolonged wear of filthy underwear and socks. I had no desire to feel the skin rot off my body, not when perfectly acceptable cotton replacements were available for a competitive price, all paid for by the House of Stadtfeld. Apparently, Ogi had gotten Callan in on his plan to make me eat whenever my stomach had the slightest available capacity, as no sooner were we back out in the cold of the mid-afternoon than I found myself being gently but firmly led to the Crepes of Brittany, an unexpectedly Francois cafe for a Britannian colony, but apparently nonetheless popular. It was standing room only as we waited in the line, and Callan took advantage of our wait time to encourage me to consider ordering the largest crepe on the menu, a monstrous pastry full of fruit, creme, and hazelnut spread. Realizing that the long arm of Ogi had already forbade all resistance, I limited my token resistance to a minor sulk, which conveniently gave me an excuse to remain silent as Callan ordered for both of us. The sulk disappeared as soon as the food arrived, and soon I found myself fearing diabetes as I crammed my mouth full, yet found myself helpless to resist the insane sweetness of the delicacy. The chocolate syrup worked into the creme filling was enough to even allow a degree of forgiveness for the Francois to enter my heart. They may have killed me the last time around, I mused, but at least they can make an excellent pastry. The fact they pulled one over being X to boot was pretty impressive too. Overall, it had been a thoroughly enjoyable trip, from a personal point of view, and another mark of Callan's development as a skilled agent from a more professional perspective. The important information-gathering process had been cloaked under the wider blanket of a girl's day out, the stop at the camping store just one of many stops at many different stores and attractions, including an amusement park. If I hadn't known that Callan had invited me to the Tokyo settlement expressly so she could get my input on potential Rising Sun purchases, I never would have realized that had been the point of the trip, especially since it had been such a brief part of that long, lazy afternoon. 2 days after that first trip, she'd invited me out for a second trip to the concession, later at night, and while she'd passed on word of the peculiar security measures around the student council clubhouse, it had been over mocktails and gourmet sandwiches at a trendy bistro, as a violinist played Vivaldi in the background. I wasn't exactly sure why she hadn't simply passed that information on to me via text, but I appreciated her superb taste in restaurants nonetheless. Honestly, between the near-constant pace of our text conversation, when she was out of school, and these recent meetings in the concession, I was starting to worry that I'd somehow imparted my overzealous work ethic on Callan. It would be bitterly ironic if in my attempt to reduce my own stress I'd managed to accidentally overwork the heiress of the Stadtfeld family, a far more important and connected player in the broader Kozuki organization than myself. I had considered sitting down with Callan as Ogi had with me, but so far the younger Kozuki had shown no sign of burnout, and since I frankly found myself greatly enjoying the restaurants she'd introduced me to, I decided to hold off on the meeting until signs of overwork actually presented themselves. Yes, overall, it had been a wonderfully relaxing week of relaxation and recuperation. That said, it was about time to bring my informal vacation to an end. Pleasant as it was to worry about nothing more than filling my face and gathering information with Callan, winter was already biting at the people of Shinjuku, and I couldn't in good conscience stay in this apartment feasting on oranges and pudding any longer. "Ogi," I mumbled around an orange slice, "we've got a problem." It truly was impressive how quickly Ogi had his sidearm drawn and pointed at the door. Within 3 seconds, he dropped the knife, hurled himself to his feet, and pulled his gun. Equally impressive was how vibrant the blush that crawled up his neck was as he realized that I hadn't moved nor shown any sign of concern. I decided not to say anything about it as he picked his chair up from the floor and sat back down. No need to rub his nose in his jumpy reaction, especially considering our line of work. The ghetto's still starving, and we're only reaching a small slice of the population with our daily food boxes. I didn't have anything approaching a census of Shinjuku, but I knew that it was unlikely that more than 3% of the population at most had managed to get food aid from the Rising Sun. We need to figure out some way to expand distribution, maybe by setting up multiple other offices around Shinjuku, but I don't know where we're going to get the funding necessary for additional sites. Ogi gravely nodded, the familiar furrow indicating concern wrinkling his forehead below his pompadour. "Yeah, Ino estimated that we've got enough money from the last mission to keep the Rising Sun running for about 7 months if we stick to food distribution, but only about 3 months at most if we want to keep providing clothes and construction materials. Which, I think, we very much do. Canned food only goes so far, we need to keep up with the other projects too." Of that I was certain. The food, more varied than the typical ghetto diet, was an important step, But without adequate shelter and warmth, not to mention access to common medication, diseases would still run rampant through Shinjuku. All of that requires money, but we're still lacking reliable income streams. Ogi chuckled grimly. Yeah, I guess raiding the gangs doesn't really constitute a regular income stream. The furrow in his brow deepened as he glared down at the smoked sausage on his plate. Ino thinks that we more or less kneecapped the economy when we blew up those arms-dealing bastards. It concerns me that we potentially damaged far more of Shinjuku than we expected. She's right. I'd talked with Ino over the last week too, and I agreed with her conclusions. It had already been difficult doing business in Shinjuku before 100-odd merchants and their gangster bodyguards had ended up entombed beneath half an office building. That said, pulling the gangs out by the roots was always going to hurt, considering how deeply embedded they are here in Shinjuku. The longer we put it off, the worse it was going to get. Besides, I took a deep breath before I continued. I no longer feared that Ogi would throw me out of the group for speaking my mind, but this would be a tough pill to swallow for the former teacher. It was difficult for me to even admit it to myself, but the writing was on the wall. We're not going to be able to help everybody, Ogi, not this winter and not in the foreseeable future. There's just not enough resources in Shinjuku to keep everybody alive, much less healthy. There's, what? 200,000? 250,000 people? All crammed into 12.5 square kilometers of developed land, with incredibly limited imports. The only economic export we've got is bodies, who either get unskilled work and poor pay or are exploited by criminals and foreign aristocrats. I closed my eyes and rubbed at my brow with frustration. As far as food or social support goes in the ghetto, we're it. Nobody else is going to step in to help out the Japanese. And we're only able to support 150 households, at best. Are you only just realizing this, Tanya? My eyes snapped open at the unexpected response, but Ogi's tone had been gentle, and there was no hint of mockery on his face. Do you remember what subject I used to teach, back before the conquest, Tanya? Math. The word fell from my lips. Of course he'd run the numbers before, so why wasn't he feeling overwhelmed by the sheer scope of the task I'd set for us? You used to be a math teacher. Ogi nodded and smiled slightly from across the table. That's right, and I sat down and worked out a rough estimate of Shinjuku's food requirements years ago, and I felt the same way you did. There's no way we'll ever be able to keep everybody alive. The only reason Shinjuku's still as densely populated now as it was then is because the Britannians keep pushing more people inside the walls as the settlement expands. He shrugged, smiling at the futility. But since you came up with the Rising Sun idea, we've done everything we could to help. We've poured time, money, and effort into getting the people of Shinjuku what they needed. I don't see anything we could have done better, in terms of building a charitable organization from the ground up while simultaneously gearing up for a war with the gangs. I don't know what expression I had on my face, but whatever he saw clearly amused Ogi, whose reassuring smile stretched and grew into an amused grin. He leaned forward and stretched across the table, reaching out just far enough to touzle my hair, before I reared back in my chair out of his reach, to his amusement. Come on, don't beat yourself up about this, Tanya. You're not perfect, and nobody expects you to deliver perfection. Ogi straightened back up in his chair, and regained his businesslike expression. Besides, there's a potential source of funding available, if we're willing to reach out and grab it. I ran my fingers through my hair, straightening it back out as I frowned at Ogi. I understand that selling amphetamine in the settlement would be a significant moneymaker if we could the operation off the ground, but I still think it's far too much risk for the sort of penny ante gains we'd make until we found a way to make and ship the product on an industrial scale. Ogi was already shaking his head by the time I was halfway through my sentence. I'm not talking about dealing drugs, I'm talking about potential patronage. Potential patronage. The idea stopped me in my tracks. While I knew we were only a deniable asset to Lord Stadtfeld, I just assumed that seeking out any other financial backers would be seen as a sign of treachery by Naoto's aristocratic father. But, if Ogi was suggesting it, who do you know with money, Ogi? Have you been holding out on us, and you're secretly the bastard of some old Japanese noble clan or something? While I was mostly joking, I was being somewhat serious. If Ogi really had been sitting on a connection powerful enough to be called a backer, that was incredibly suspicious. No, nothing that dramatic. Ogi smiled, but shook his head. figures. 2 noble bastards is one thing, 3 would be overdoing it. And I don't actually know the money bags in question, to tell you the truth. But I do know of them. They're called the 6 Houses of Kyoto, and they're either the biggest traitors in Japanese history or the backbone of the resistance to Britannia, depending on your point of view. I'd long wondered how Britannia managed the all-important saccharide mines, not to mention the transportation networks, refining facilities, and other attendant infrastructure. It had been the main casus belli of the conquest, almost 6 years ago, and by all accounts the bulk of Britannian military strength in Area 11 was concentrated around the mining complex at Mount Fuji. According to Ogi, when the Britannians had effectively conquered Japan in a day, they'd captured the Sakuradite industrial apparatus completely intact. After consolidating their hold on the newly dubbed Area 11, the Britannians had opted to keep not only the old facilities, but also the families that had owned, operated, and managed those facilities as well. The industrialists had turned their coats and had cheerfully provided the Britannians as much saccharide as they wished, and as far as the public knew that state of affairs continued through to the present. However, in the underground network of resistance organizations large and small, word had gotten out that the reviled collaborating plutocrats were also in the business of sponsoring rebellion against Britannia, providing arms, funds, and connections to any group that caught their eye and delivered results in the war against the occupiers. Somehow, the Britannians supervising the 6 houses had completely failed to notice the illicit activities of the allegedly loyal honorary Britannians who controlled their strategic resource extraction industry. This answered many questions for me, including why the few Japanese I'd heard mention Kyoto always spat. Apparently, the wealthy aristocrats and plutocrats of the 6 houses hadn't been the only ones to embrace Britannian subjugation within the first year of the conquest. The entire Kyoto prefecture had mostly gone over to the Britannians as part of a deal to avoid any fighting in the ancient capital, and since then many honorary Britannians who had found favor in the eyes of the area administration had moved to Kyoto. It was impossible to tell how many of those new Kyoto inhabitants were like Suwakiro's son Keith, and how many were part of the same secret operation as the 6 houses. Frankly, I was deeply suspicious of this faction of well-heeled aristocrats. It was impossible to tell what role, if any, their convictions and loyalty to their homeland played in their decision-making. What was very clear was that this group was extremely good at playing both sides to guarantee their survival. It hadn't escaped my attention either that one of the many services the Kyoto group provided, according to Ogi, was the delivery of advanced weaponry for free or for a reduced price, meaning that they likely were the ones manufacturing said weaponry. Nothing is better for an arms dealer than an endless war, and I darkly wondered how many arms contracts the 6 houses had filled for Clovis La Britannia in his efforts to put down the rebellion they themselves had fostered. I wonder if they've got any publicly traded stock available. That sounds like an incredibly safe investment. Anyway, Nagata says that Asahara Hayashi has a line of contact to one of the 6 houses, and thinks that Mr. Asahara would be happy to bring us to Kyoto House's attention. For a suitable price, of course. Ogi finished his explanation and popped another sausage and cracker mini sandwich into his mouth. I don't trust him, but money's money. Plus, if they donate to Rising Sun, that might help their public relations problem too, and it would help us pump more food into Shinjuku in no time. I thought about it for a long minute, and then another. If we could establish a connection between a rich bloc and Rising Sun, the Kozuki organization, or both, all kinds of possibilities would open up. We'd have enough money to invest in long-term projects, like Suwakiro's idea of building chicken coops throughout Shinjuku for meat and eggs, or Ino's idea of setting up fungus farms down in some of the deeper, wetter parts of the subway tunnels. We'd perhaps have enough funds to secure a supply of Tdap vaccines to start vaccine clinics for the children of Shinjuku, reducing childhood mortality and preserving the workforce of tomorrow. We might even have enough money to implement Ogi's idea of a school for the Japanese, one that would actually teach something useful, unlike the Shinjuku School for 11s. If the 6 houses could get weapons into Shinjuku, it would also make it much easier to break the gangs once and forever, and perhaps then we could turn our attention towards the Britannians. On the other hand, these men were clearly not to be trusted. Any help they gave would doubtless come with many attached strings. Not to mention the fact that, if they ever actually got found out after they publicly donated to Rising Sun, I doubted Ino's fraudulent bookkeeping would fool the Britannians for long. An army can't run without beans, bandages, and bullets. And gold is the sinew of war. Please ask Nagata to visit Mr. Asahara at his earliest convenience to inquire about the price of arranging a meeting. Best to kick the can down the road a bit. No need to jump into a piranha pool at the drop of a hat, but no need to reject the potential benefits either. Plus, if Asahara's middleman's cut was too steep, I could always wait until the 6 houses contacted us themselves. They'll notice us sooner rather than later. If Ogi's right about their reach, they've definitely got spies in Shinjuku. After a quick wash-up, I made my way out of the apartment, bundled up against the December cold with my new jacket hidden under Ogi's battered old black sweatshirt. Despite the cold and the ice coating the pavement, I smiled as I stepped outside onto the bleak Shinjuku street. Across the street from the apartment building's entrance, a bright yellow flyer topped by a radiant red half-sun peeking over the black line of the horizon desultorily flapped in the breeze, pulling at the nail that anchored it firmly in place. I knew that there were at least 50 of these posters nailed up around my area of Shinjuku. After all, I'd hammered that nail into place late last night. Regularly eating with Ogi had reminded me of other shared meals, long ago and far away. Those meals, taken in bunkers, trenches, snowy forests, or all too rarely in actual mess halls, had frequently tasted awful and had completely failed to fill the stomachs of my soldiers and even left my tiny body quite peckish. All too often, the shared meat ration had to be cooked over a campfire, resulting in burnt outsides and bloody raw interiors. The potatoes had been soft and putrid, and the bread had been full of sawdust. Despite all of those drawbacks, and despite my carping at the time, I wouldn't have traded those horrible dinners for the finest restaurant in Berin. The shared misery, coupled with the occasional bottle of illicit liquor shared between everybody but me, had built a strong bond between the men and women of the 203rd, myself included. And when it had been vicious night to cook, the army rations had been edible, even something close to enjoyable. Hunger might be the best spice, but a shared meal fulfilled the fighting soldier spiritually as well as physically. Why not bring all of Shinjuku in on this? I'd asked Ogi, after making sure that a communal meal would also meet my mandated shared meal requirement as well. Are you more likely to help a friend you've shared a meal and conversation with, or some neighbor you've only ever met once or twice a year? And so, I'd changed up the Rising Suns program for today. Instead of providing our usual food packages to go, we'd be serving a communal meal of rice and beans, along with boiled cabbage and carrots. It wouldn't be fancy, but hopefully it would be filling, and it would give the attendees an opportunity to sit down in a warm room with food and water and get to know each other. Ideally, this sort of communal activity would inspire mutualistic relationships between both the members of the community and the Rising Sun Benevolent Association. We'd need all the help we could get before things in Shinjuku were settled, after all. Tamaki, Nagata, and Naoto were already waiting for me outside the Rising Sun building by the time I'd managed to pick my way through Shinjuku's icy streets. All 3 were bundled up, but they still seemed to be in good spirits, despite the chill. Morning. Naoto noticed me first and loudly greeted me, waving both arms over his head as if he was concerned I'd somehow failed to notice him among the sparse crowd of pedestrians. Glad you're finally up and moving, sleepyhead. My scowl did nothing to dent his irritatingly high spirits, but it did make Tamaki laugh. Truly, I am beset by treachery on all sides. No, wait, one of my so-called comrades remains true. Doing my best to suppress the smirk that threatened to ruin my stoic demeanor as Tamaki nearly fell on his ass after stepping on a patch of ice, proving that there was some justice in the universe after all, I turned to Nagata and handed over the folder I'd brought with me from the apartment. Since you're the only adult I see here, Nagata, you get the paperwork. Congratulations. Nagata accepted the folder with a wry smile, turning and waving it at Naoto. Better watch your back, Naoto, Tanya's put me in charge for the day. A coup, is it? Naoto took a dramatic pose, setting a foot on the first step of the approach up to the Rising Sun's entrance, pointing dramatically at Nagata. Tamaki, defend my rule. Before Tamaki managed to take a step towards Nagata, presumably to try grappling the lanky man into submission, I decided that this was more than enough fun and games. Fight on your own time. You've got beans and cabbage to pick up. The folder I'd handed to Nagata contained several manifests and order forms, all bearing the signature of Rivals Cardamone authorizing the purchases. I hadn't felt the need to ask Callan to bother the boy for approval, Of course, since I'd long since made a rubber stamp of his signature. Nagata and Naoto would be spending the day in the concession, renting a truck as per usual and hauling in a shipment of bulk bought rice and beans, as well as a supply of cabbages and carrots purchased from an honorary Britannian-operated farm outside of Tokyo, plus a shipment of cooking oil, gasoline, and vitamin pills. To cap it off, they would also be hauling in several large portable electric ranges I'd ordered at the camping supply store during my trip with Callan. Most of the food was earmarked for tonight's meal, and as such the schedule was tight. Who knew how bad traffic in Tokyo would be, after all, or if some guard decided to shake Nagata down for an extra large bribe. After I explained my reasoning at length, at a very reasonable volume and with a minimum of chastisement, Nagata and Naoto were soon on their way, and a cowed Tamaki followed me into the Rising Sun. We had a busy day ahead of us too, getting the main hall of the Rising Sun building set up with as many tables and chairs as we could fit into the former office space. Besides, we also had to filter and boil a large amount of water, both in preparation for cooking tonight's food and so our hungry attendees had something to wash down the bland yet cheap food we'd be providing. Thankfully, separated from his fellow miscreants, Tamaki buckled down and helped me haul the collapsible tables and folding chairs the Rising Sun had acquired back during our initial setup. As he got the table legs straightened out, with much cursing and anger as the abused furniture kept trying to close on his fingers, I began the process of filtering and boiling the water we'd need. The process was hampered by the slow spluttering pace of the tap, and I mentally added refurbish the water mains to my growing wish list for Shinjuku. Honestly, it's a shock the Britannians haven't cut off the utilities entirely yet. Sure, the sewers frequently leaked and the storm water drain system was completely busted, but somehow most of the ghetto still had access to at least some clean water. No guarantee that'll last, though. It was somewhat of a dull day, but I enjoyed the simple yet fruitful work. Naoto and Nagata returned in plenty of time, and soon the ranges were connected to the generator installed in the basement of the Rising Sun building. The sounds of peeling and chopping filled the air as several large pots of rice simmered and the beans began to boil, warming the dining hall. The other members of the Kozuki cell slowly filtered in and started helping out with the food prep, or in Suikairo's case, unpacking the boxes of disposable bowls, cups, and cutlery from the back of the truck. Nagata briefly disappeared, but returned soon with his wife Ami in tow. I'd never met her, nor their child, who had been left with a local grandmother for the night in exchange for a to-go bowl of beans and rice, but I could see that Nagata hadn't been fantasizing when he'd spoken fondly about his wife. The couple were obviously affectionate with each other, and judging by Ami's rough and calloused hands, both were working hard to provide their little family with a better future. As the sun began its early wintertime retreat from the sky over Shinjuku, our first guests for the night began to arrive. I recognized most of them as frequent recipients of aid from Rising Sun, men and women who had accepted our help before, and in lots of cases had turned around and contributed towards helping their community. I greeted the few I had met during the handful of times I'd helped distribute food or clothes, and pointed them towards the start of the food line. Since food preparation had more or less been accomplished, I left Tamaki to keep stirring the still simmering pots of rice and beans while directing Naoto and Chihiro towards the food line to serve up the boiled vegetables and the entree. I tasked Suikairo, who had come with his pistol under his jacket and a baton hanging from his belt, to man the door and keep an eye out for trouble, and Hadano and Ogi, as the two most frequent helpers at the Rising Sun, circulate through the growing crowd. Nominally, they were supposed to bus cutlery and cups that could be reused to Nagata and Ami, who had set up a washing station behind the food line, but I wanted them to primarily start up conversation with the people who came to eat. The point of this event was, after all, to help build a community, which might require a little ice-breaking. I took up a ladle and stationed myself by the large steel pot full of boiled water, ready to fill cups. We'd left it, along with the two other pots full of filtered and boiled water, in the back alley under cover for a few hours, so it was nice and icy cold. As I scooped water into waiting cups for thirsty diners, I kept an eye on the increasingly packed room. The flyers had done the trick, and lured by the prospect of a free meal in a nice warm room, the citizens of Shinjuku had come. Children clustered around parents, but every child had their own bowl. Nobody would have to share a single serving tonight. Entire families took up the ends of tables, elderly matriarchs surrounded by family. Groups of young men and women formed their own clusters, and of course the omnipresent bottles of cheapsake and homemade rotgut soon made their appearance, passing from hand to hand. The sounds of laughter and chatter filled the hall, and through the growing crowd Ogi and Ino shuttled, making a joke here, dipping into a quick conversation there, introducing this person to that group and so on, coming back to the rear of the room every now and then to drop piles of plastic cutlery into the basin of soapy water or sodden paper bowls into the trash can. It was hard to tell how many people had come through the line, as some people came through to get second servings, or to ask for covered bowls to take back to bedridden relatives or to neighbors staying to look after children, but I estimated that we had fed at least 350 people a nice-filling dinner by the time 5 hours had passed. Nobody seemed particularly eager to leave the warmth of the Rising Sun's building, and I wasn't eager to kick them out. I had nothing planned for tonight, and after-dinner conversation is great for networking. Of course, it was just as the warm self-satisfaction at a job well done filled me that the doors to the Rising Sun banged open once again, letting in both the cold wind of the December night and a group of 7 young men and women. These new arrivals were clearly not like the rest of the Japanese filling the hall, and neither were they here for a bowl of beans and rice. All 7 had bright canary yellow scarves tied around their right biceps in the typical gangster style, though I didn't know what gang had bright yellow as their specific color. Interestingly, despite all 7 having identical scarves tied around their arms, that was where the uniform look ended. The leading 3 gangsters of the group were clearly aping Britannian styles, with the 2 men sporting brightly and badly dyed blonde hair, while the woman had opted for a bright bubblegum pink. At least her roots aren't showing across the room. All 3 wore garish outfits that were clearly of Britannian manufacture, and clearly meant to look like the typical outfits worn by nobles. Having actually seen what real nobles wore, thanks to my trip to the Stadtfeld Manor, I was distinctly unimpressed. The Britannians as a whole were far more comfortable showing skin than the Japanese, but the Britannian-style dress the woman was wearing was skimpy even by foreign standards. Hell of a thing to be wearing outside at 10 o'clock at night in December. The men's suits were ill-fitting and stained, and the golden epaulets glittering on their shoulders looked as if they'd been badly sewn on by hands unaccustomed to such work. Despite this, the pistols all 3 carried were as Britannian as they come, and looked like the same military model that Naoto had provided us with. By contrast, the 4 gangsters hanging back wore similar clothing to the bulk of the people in the hall, that is to say, typical Shinjuku clothing. Threadbare shirts and thin jackets, work pants with patched knees and belts cinched tight to waistlines shrunken with hunger. The 3 men and 1 woman of the group had no pretensions to the Britannian stylings of their apparent superiors, and all 4 had closely cropped hair, likely as an anti-lice measure. Their features were worn and gaunt, their frames only slightly less wasted than the typical Shinjuku dweller, and none of them looked particularly eager to fight. Still, each of them was armed with a weapon of some kind, though unlike the 3 leaders none of the 4 had a pistol. Instead, 2 held knives, 1 rested a battered baseball bat on his shoulder, and the woman carried a humble claw hammer. From the corner of my eye, I saw Suichiro looking to me for direction, his hand already wrapped around the heft of his baton. Off to the side of the door, the gangsters hadn't noticed him yet. I shook my head and he nodded, taking his hand off the baton and stepping back into the mass of citizenry. If he tried to attack the gangsters now, he'd be unsupported, on the other end of the densely packed hall from the rest of us, except for Ogi and Ino, who were stuck somewhere in the middle of the crowd. As the gangsters began to approach through the middle of the room, the 3 leaders swaggering as people desperately made a path, pulling children out of the way, I cursed internally. Ogi had a gun, and Suichiro had a gun, but nobody else did as far as I knew. I hadn't expected such a brazen attack in front of so many people. That said, if a gang was going to attack the Rising Sun Benevolent Association for whatever reason, why would they send so few people? It made no sense. Unless, this isn't an attack at all. This is a shakedown. Damn it, how could I have been so stupid? The Rising Sun had been throwing around a lot of resources lately. Renting a truck to import shipments of goods from the outside world into Shinjuku had been a necessity for our operation, but the costs necessary for that truck alone, the rental fees, the fuel, the bribery, must have thrown up a huge signal that we were a cash-rich organization, or at least that we had something worth stealing. And that doesn't even touch the value of whatever they think we were importing. The gangs probably assumed that the Rising Sun was a front for some sort of drug smuggling business or the like. They were wrong on that count, It was a front and a public relations organ for an armed combat organization dedicated to political terrorism, but I could forgive that error, seeing how they were absolutely correct that we had things worth stealing. Unfortunately, all of the valuables, including our cash reserves and our pilfered drugs and weapons, were all at the hideout, not here on site where we could freely hand them over to buy protection. There's no way they're going to believe that we don't have any money on site. And if they refuse to believe that, things are going to get nasty. As I'd furiously worked out how badly I'd screwed our entire operation over, the little knot of gangsters had continued to advance. It was telling how badly beaten the people of Shinjuku were. Collectively, only 7 gangsters, only 3 with guns, were enough to intimidate the several hundred civilians present. Nobody was meeting the smirking eyes of the 3 leaders, and nobody looked the least bit interested in challenging them. Thankfully, that included Ogi and Ino as well, who I noticed were carefully mimicking the reactions of those around them, keeping their eyes downcast even as I noticed Ino slowly drawing a knife as the last of the ragged gangsters passed her by. I've got to take control of the situation before someone makes a stupid move and starts a bloodbath. Dropping my ladle as I engaged my strengthening and reflex-enhancing suite, I swung myself over the serving table, feet easily clearing the pot of cabbage and carrots, and dropped down on the other side of the food line, right in front of the approaching gangsters. To my surprise, my enhanced strength felt even more enhanced than usual, somehow, approaching what I had been able to manage with a mere thought in my old life, though still nowhere close to what I'd been able to do with a computation jewel. I'll worry about it later. Similarly, my reflexes felt like they'd somehow been kicked into overdrive. I'd swung myself over the table so quickly that I'd nearly stumbled when I'd landed, and it seemed like the world was somehow moving slower than it should. In the seemingly stretched seconds, I noticed Naoto was peeling off his serving gloves and trying to hurry around the serving tables too, but the throng of people and the cramped space we'd been forced to set the food line up in to make room for all the tables made it hard for him to extricate himself. Looks like it's up to me to make the first impression. Folding my arms, I drew myself up to my full, admittedly unimpressive, height, and cocked an eyebrow at the still advancing gang. The 3 leaders' only reactions were sneers from the men and a condescending laugh from the woman, clearly affected after the all-too-familiar haughty laugh so beloved by wealthy Britannian ladies, and they continued to swagger towards me, the central gangster only halting a meter away while the other 2 moved a step or 2 closer, almost flanking me. I noticed the 4 grunts forming a vague semicircle a few steps behind the central gangster, but they still looked generally unenthusiastic, and seemed to be paying more attention to the large pots of food on the tables behind me. The center gangster, still with a shit-eating grin on his face, started to open his mouth, which was my cue to start my pitch. "You're welcome to join us for dinner. The line starts over there, the food's free, so is the water." They were, after all, residents of Shinjuku. The poster had clearly stated that every resident of Shinjuku was welcome to join us for dinner. No pushing, no shoving. There's plenty to go around for everybody. I spoke clearly and loudly, making sure to account for my current enhanced state so I wouldn't speak too rapidly, doing my best to emphasize in front of the murmuring audience that if anything was going to happen, it'd be these guys who'd start it. The gangster directly ahead of me laughed, a short, ugly thing. I'd heard that laugh before, from the mouths of other men who intended on making themselves a problem. "We didn't come here for fucking dinner. Fuck off with your rice and beans, you little Brit bitch, and point us towards the cash." He leaned in closer, until his face was barely 5 inches from my own. "If you're a good little girl and tell us where the money's hidden, maybe we won't take you with us when we leave." Then again. And then the bastard actually sniffed at me, and his lips rolled back, exposing his visibly rotten teeth. Then again, "Some of those rich creeps like 'em skinny, and they might pay good for a blonde." For a moment, the rage was so intense I felt like I was choking, trying to hold it back. Only the mental discipline that years of waiting and watching for any opportunity to break my way and get me away from the war, out of the ghetto, had instilled in me gave me the strength to not murder the son of a bitch where he stood. Gotta make them throw the first punch. Come on. Come on. I had to get them angrier while still being eminently reasonable. That way, when I took them apart, I'd be unquestionably in the right, and nobody would think to connect me to any sort of premeditated attack, like a certain recent bombing. "What do you think you're doing here?" I let a thin dribble of emotion into my voice, not rage but righteous indignation. Cold and controlled wouldn't play well, they like their prey to be upset, off balance. We're just here trying to make life in Shinjuku slightly less awful. Why are you trying to mess with us, huh? The pink kid laughed that horribly fake laugh again, nearly falling out of her tiny dress as a result. You stupid little bitch, don't you get it? She let her hand drop to the pistol, holstered in an incongruously sturdy belt. Judging by the rest of her sartorial dresses, she must have taken it from someone else. The weak are just meat for the strong to eat, and we're the strongest people in Shinjuku. I ignored her laugh and watched her eyes. They were full of mingled anger, fear, and exultation. So you'd better get out of our way, little girl, otherwise we'll eat you all up. I snorted. It was hard enough to control my anger with these blowhards, and impossible to keep my amusement hidden as well too. Sorry, are you saying you're strong, then? You're not even strong enough to be proud of being Japanese, and no matter how much you dye your hair and dress like them, you're never going to be Britannians. Since you're stuck in Shinjuku like the rest of us, you couldn't even be honorary Britannians, could you? I realized I was smiling, grinning really, teeth bared at the trio of gangsters who loomed over me. I knew they were dangerous, knew that by questioning their strength I'd just crossed their red line, but I couldn't help but laugh at them. Clothes might make the man, but to the Britannians you're still just dirty 11s. If a Britannian actually saw the way you dressed, they'd laugh in your faces at your silly costumes. Now get in line for your meal or get out of my way. The gangster directly ahead of me lost his cool first. With an animalistic bellow of "Shut the fuck up, you little hafu whore," he began to swing for me, a clearly telegraphed right-handed haymaker. Finally, took him long enough. To my enhanced eyes, it was almost like we were sparring, and the target was a partner giving me a nice easy opportunity to set up an arm lock. Unfortunately for him, we weren't sparring, and so instead of blocking his punch I ducked low, below the arc of his fist, and took 2 rapid steps forward, putting me inside his guard at the cost of letting the 3 gangsters surround me. As the fist swung over and past my head, I retaliated, channeling every bit of anger that had accrued at their disgusting insults and ramming the base of my palm straight into his solar plexus. The close quarters didn't let me fully extend my arm, which would have maximized the impact, but the enhanced strength made that a moo tissue as I could clearly feel the crunching of breaking cartilage under my hand. Ruthlessly, I poured more hoarded magic into the blow, sinking into a lunging position as I hurled all 67 pounds I had to my name against him. I exulted as I felt as much as heard the air being driven from his lungs as my palm forcibly compressed his diaphragm, driving broken shards of cartilage deep into the soft tissues inside his rib cage as I did so. To guarantee that my first target was incapacitated, I whipped my trailing right leg forwards and up, rising from my lunge as I rammed my knee into his groin before taking a step back as he began to fall forwards, contracting around both his injured genitals and the crushing wound to his torso. It probably wasn't strictly necessary, but I couldn't deny that seeing the bastard blanch with pain was viscerally satisfying. As I took my step back, a hand slammed into my neck from the right, grasping for my throat. Fortunately, my adversary had missed his chance to grab my trachea and instead of trying to resist the impact I moved with the momentum, taking a step to my left and pivoting on my left heel, ending up on my female enemy's left flank. As I turned, I took a quick look at the other 4 gangsters, and, absent any orders from their superiors, they were all still hanging back, keeping well clear of the fight. Very wise. The pink-haired gangster tried to keep me in front of her, starting to turn as I came up behind her, but in the face of my enhancements she might as well have been standing still for how slowly she moved. I threw a right jab straight into her left kidney, her skimpy dress doing nothing to cushion the blow, and as she started to topple forwards, crying out in pain, I kicked her behind her left knee, forcing it to fold and sending her hurtling to the ground at speed. I was about to kick my opponent in the head now that she was down, just to make sure she wouldn't get back up while I handled my third target, when I heard the telltale muted crackle of an electromagnetically accelerated weapon. Despite the comparatively innocuous noise compared to the sounds of explosive propellant from my previous life, my heart immediately skipped a beat at the noise. A bullet whizzed past my ear, presumably the sound of the second shot drowned out by the blood suddenly rushing in my ears, and I realized that the last man had escalated before I could get to him. He had managed to draw his pistol before I could send him to the floor with his friends, and I was about to be shot if I didn't move now. A moment later, I was diving forwards, hurling myself towards the last man and the Britannian pistol clutched in his shaking hand. I saw his finger twitch, and suddenly it felt like a strand of white-hot wire had been dragged across my right forearm. As if by magic, a red groove suddenly appeared, crossing the top of my right forearm in a long diagonal from the middle of the wrist to a point halfway to my elbow, and I dimly felt the heated wire brush past the side of my ribs, almost right below my armpit. The groove was only visible for a split second to my enhanced eyes before the welling blood obscured the outline, but more importantly I saw the gangster minutely shift his aim, redirecting the barrel right at my face, and I saw his finger start to tighten for a fourth time. And then I saw a look of profound surprise and rage on the gangster's face as his gun arm was abruptly forced up just as he squeezed the trigger, sending the bullet with my name on it up into the first-floor ceiling of the Rising Sun building. The gangster immediately got over his surprise and attempted to wrestle his gun and the arm holding it free, but by that time I was inside his arms, and it was too late for him. I slammed both of my fists into his belly with all the magically enhanced strength I could muster, punching once, twice, and then grabbing his head and forcing it down into my rising knee. I felt his jaw break and the teeth give way under my knee, but I grimly held onto his temples and slammed my knee up again, feeling the nose give way and smear against my patella. He was obviously unconscious before he hit the ground, and his face was a pulp of bloody flesh and splintered bone and cartilage, his mouth a ragged red hole. I turned to the man who had just, in all probability, saved my life by grabbing my last target's gun arm, and nearly attacked him when I saw a yellow scarf wrapped around his right arm. Seeing my sudden start towards him, the man quickly dropped the knife dangling in his left hand and put both hands over his head. I forced myself to stop, muscles quivering with adrenaline and the urge to break all too fragile limbs, and took a quick look around. The other three ragged gangsters hadn't moved from their positions in the loose semicircle around the miniature battleground, but all of them followed their comrades' lead and dropped their weapons, hands shooting into the sky. I took a deep breath, held it for a second, and let it all out in a rush, venting the rage and bloodlust with the carbon dioxide. The man who had saved my life looked about as weary, and ragged as most Japanese in Area 11, and looked like he was about a second away from trying to run. Again, very wise. For a moment, I considered just letting him go, along with his fellow ragged foot soldiers, before I realized the folly of the thought. These were fighting-aged Japanese who clearly had at least some familiarity with violence, and if what I thought I knew about gangs was anything close to accurate, they probably got next to nothing in exchange for their loyalty, since they just stood back and let their probable bosses get beaten into the ground without lifting a finger to help. That minimal payment clearly hadn't been enough. The gangs had fallen into a classic human resources management trap, and had mistaken the minimum income as adequate to purchase 100% of their employees' effort, rather than just being adequate to purchase their attendance. Besides, I doubted the gang's leadership showed much respect or care for their lowest-ranked followers. Also, since they left with those three idiots, I doubt whoever's running their group will be happy if they show back up without them. Overall, the four ragged, terrified gangsters were ready for an alternative job offer. Moving slowly, I raised my right arm and offered my hand towards the gangster who had broken ranks to save my life. To my sudden annoyance, I realized I'd offered my injured limb to him, and the blood from the groove left by the grazing bullet had already begun to dribble down my hand. Unfortunately, rapidly pulling back the extended hand would have signaled the wrong message entirely, and so I ignored the dripping redness as I met the man's eyes. "You must be hungry, please, stay for a meal in the warmth, don't just go back out into the cold. The food's not great, but it tastes far better shared than eaten alone." Without breaking eye contact, I extended my other hand towards the other three gangsters, barely visible in my peripheral vision. "All are welcome under the light of the rising sun, and this meal is for all of Shinjuku. That includes you." Hesitantly, skittishly, moving slowly and deliberately, the first gangster lowered his arms, raised his left hand to the yellow scarf on his right bicep, and untied the knot, letting the scarf fall to the ground. Then, he stepped over the scarf, and took my outstretched hand, and gave it a soft, overly gentle shake. TCH. Treating me like a child when he just saw me beat down three adults. I'm not a damn doll. And then he froze, still holding my hand and clearly not sure what to do next. "The line starts over there." We both jumped as a masculine tenor suddenly made itself known over my shoulder. Pulling my hand free, I started to turn towards the voice, but nearly staggered, As I'd been making my recruitment pitch, I'd taken my mind off my enhancement suite, and it had begun to wind down, leaving me suddenly aware of the hot stinging pain coming from my arm and my side. I also realized I was feeling woozy, as if the world was starting to spin under my feet. Before I could fall down and make a fool of myself, strong hands braced my shoulders. The gangster, or perhaps former gangster now, nodded frantically and scuttled off towards the food line, closely followed by his 3 comrades. Looking up, I saw Naoto glaring down at me. He looked extremely worried, very angry, and profoundly relieved, a combination I'd only seen once before, when Callan had returned fully intact after the mission to the train station. I couldn't blame him in the slightest. I was angry too, that our simple attempt to build community among the people of Shinjuku had been targeted by a gang, and I was very worried about the shots that had flown past me a minute ago. I hoped nobody else had been hurt. And I was extremely, horribly relieved that I was still alive. I thought I was about to die. I almost died. I should be dead. Just standing suddenly felt like far too much to ask, and I sagged back into Naoto's hands, my head swimming more than ever. I heard a rising clamor, and somewhere nearby Ogi was yelling that it's fine, she'll be okay. A few minutes later, I was seated on a folding chair at a table, minus my jacket and overshirt, a bowl of beans and rice in front of me and bandages wrapped around my arm and my chest. Ogi stood next to me, glowering at the 3 men and 1 woman staring straight down at the food in front of them, not making eye contact as they wolfed down their helpings. Behind me, I heard Ino chatting on a burner phone, trying to get in contact with a former paramedic who ran a small unlicensed clinic. Apparently, Ino thought I'd need stitches, and considering how blood was already starting to ooze through my bandages, she was probably correct about that. Nagata and Naoto were busy tying up the 3 Britannian wannabes, and were being none too gentle about the process. Soon, all 3 vanished into the back room of the Rising Sun, presumably to be shoved into a supply closet or something until we figured out what to do with them. Some of the Shinjuku residents had left as soon as the fight had ended, displaying an admirable degree of sense, but most had remained, and were talking in a low mutter that filled the hall with a dull roar. Annoyingly, most of them kept looking at me, which wouldn't have been such an issue if I was able to stand on my own 2 feet and hadn't nearly gotten myself killed like an overconfident idiot. So, I began, desperate for distraction from the hundreds of eyes I felt. How do you end up in a gang? It was admittedly not my finest conversational maneuver, but I was perfectly content with blaming my bluntness on the blood loss and the fact I'd been shot less than 20 minutes earlier. Admittedly, it was a grazing wound, but it had been the first time I had been shot, at least in this body. Was it for protection? For food and supplies? Did you have habits that needed to be satisfied? I paused, and realized my barrage of questions had sounded needlessly interrogative. Look, I tried, aiming for a gentler tone. If we're going to be working together, I need to know you. You do want to work with me, right? Apparently, honey still catches more flies than vinegar. I soon learned that 3 of my new recruits had joined the gang for food and protection, although 1 had apparently briefly been a part of the Kokirikai before that organization's untimely dissolution. Hojo, as the ex-gangster who still had my blood on his hand named himself, confessed to an opiate habit. He claimed that he'd sustained a badly broken arm when the floor of the poorly maintained building he'd been squatting at the time gave out. He even pulled up the leg of his much-mended and badly stained trousers, revealing a nasty twisting scar that looped around a visibly malformed shin. Apparently, he'd had to splint it himself, and had relied on mooching off his family for months as it had slowly healed. Somewhere along the way, someone had given him a bottle of oxy, either out of an attempt to ease his pain or just to stop the moaning, but either way that help had proven misguided, and he'd been ridden by that monkey for the last 3 years. Being a member of a gang had given him the membership price when it came to feeding his habit, and it had given him the opportunity to collect enough valuables from his victims to pay that price. I wasn't sure what the best course of action for dealing with that particular uncle would be, so I simply nodded and thanked him for his forthrightness. I owed him one, and simply recruiting him into an organization that prided itself on supporting its members wouldn't be enough to settle the score. We had at least some pain pills we'd looted from the station market, but simply enabling the addiction would just kick the can down the road. Plus, those pills were valuable bartering chips, not to mention that when they ran out Hojo's loyalty would suddenly become suspect. After a while, the introductions and anecdotes tapered off, and I decided it was time to turn the conversation towards business. You've got two choices, three, maybe. You can enjoy your meal, and leave when you're done, and do your best to get out of Shinjuku as fast as possible, or you can stay here, help us clean up, and help us with our other activities. I smiled at the four, who'd finally grown comfortable enough to actually meet my eyes. Ogi grumbled beside me as he wound a fresh bandage around my arm, but I ignored him. If he had objections, he could ask for a moment of my time or simply express them in an understandable manner. Of course, you could try going back to your old gang, but it doesn't sound like any of you were particularly happy there, and as soon as word of tonight's events gets out, I can't guarantee you'll be welcomed back with open arms. Nobody looked surprised at that, thankfully. Dealing with idiots was always tiresome, especially when I was already a bit tired out. If you'll be joining us, I expect you to follow orders, and to complete our training program. Naoto, the redhead over by the food, is our leader, and Ogi here is our second in command, so you'd better listen to them, got it? Four nodding heads showed me that they did understand, although the woman and one of the men, not Hojo, looked startled at the announcement of Ogi's rank. Strangely enough, they both suddenly looked quite scared, and I could only assume that they'd suffered under the hands of their previous employer's leadership. No matter, I'm sure they'll warm up to him soon enough. I winced, remembering my own flawed first impression of the man. Or not. So long as they listen, it doesn't matter. I can't guarantee that the training will be easy, but I can promise you plenty to eat, and that we don't beat our subordinates for being less than perfect here. Noticing the none too subtle gestures Ogi and Ino had started making, I made my goodbyes and directed the four to either be out of Shinjuku by the time the rising sun touched the sky tomorrow, or to go and talk with Naoto. All four made a beeline towards the rear of the building, to my pleasure, and I followed Ogi into a side room, Ino taking up a position outside the door to guarantee us a bit of privacy. Okay, we've got a price negotiated to get your arm and your side stitched up. Since we're providing our own antiseptic and anesthesia, it's pretty generous. Ogi started talking almost as soon as the door closed, ushering me into the sole chair in the room before slouching against the desk. We'll get moving in a second, but before we go, are you sure about recruiting those guys? Nobody in the cell knows any of them, and one of them freely admitted to being a junkie. We can't keep recruiting friends and family alone, Ogi. I squirmed a bit in my seat, guiltily but not nervously. I had no doubts that Ogi and Naoto would back my decision to the hilt, but I had somewhat superseded my authority by offering the four former gangsters a place in our organization without running the idea by either of them. If we do that, it'll make things much worse once the fight with the Britannians begins in earnest, and we start losing people. Plus, there's a finite number of people who people already in our group can personally vouch for. We're going to need more hands than that, for both the Rising Sun and for the cell. This was all reasonable, but I certainly understood why Ogi was questioning my logic here. Besides, they're going to be in training for a while, so I'll have plenty of time to get to know them and to test their reliability. If one or all of them don't make it, I shrugged. Not like there's any shortage of alleys in Shinjuku. Maybe I'll even take them to the dumpsters myself and cheat the haulers. Ogi nodded at that, a bleak smile crossing his face for a moment, before the determined frown he'd worn during our conversation a few days ago came forward instead. I'd grown familiar with the large variety of frowns Ogi had, ranging from the thoughtful to the mildly concerned to the look of grim resolve he now bore. There was, it seemed, no arguing with that particular frown. Fine, but you're not going to be training them. Before I could acknowledge this, he continued on, his words as implacable in their advance as the slow strangulation of the Albish starvation blockade. You have just been injured, and you will rest adequately to ensure a full and complete recovery if I have to tie you to a cot myself. There is plenty of work to be done helping Ino, Callan, and Naoto without a bit of heavy lifting, and that is what you'll be doing at least until the stitches come out. I know you're eager to train your new recruits, but someone else can handle that. Don't fight me on this. I'm not going to. I took advantage of the punctuating pause to finally slip a word in edgewise. The way his firm expression cracked with fissures of surprise and suspicion was amusing, but I pressed on instead of savoring the expression. I'm not an idiot, Ogi. Of course I'm going to take a break from physical activity while I'm recovering. That was the easy, sensible part. Time for the still sensible yet oddly difficult to actually say part. And you made your point earlier. We're a group, an organization, and I can't do everything myself. So, I trust you and Naoto to know what to do. I recommend that you let Tamaki handle the day-to-day training for the men. He knows his guns, and he's clearly very interested in workout routines. More to the point, he's knowledgeable and loves proving it. If you put him in charge of sharing his skills, that will give him an opportunity to prove himself as he so desperately wants in a constructive way. I smirked at Ogi. He still looked slightly gobsmacked, but he'd re-engaged his brain enough to nod along. Still got it. While Naoto and Tamaki handle those greenhorns, I want you to help Hino keep Rising Sun moving. I'll be borrowing Nagata for a bit, at least for long enough to meet with Mr. Asahara. After all, I probably won't need to fight anybody to open negotiations with Kyoto House. After several long hours, to Kozuki Naoto's relief, the communal dinner Tanya had dropped in everybody's laps the day before finally came to an end. Tanya herself had left over an hour ago, hustled out the door by Ogi, Nagata, and Nagata's wife Ami, who were intent on getting her to the nearest thing approaching an urgent care facility Shinjuku could offer, leaving the cleanup to the remaining members of the Rising Sun, as well as a handful of volunteers who'd helped Tamaki and Chihiro wrestle the tables and chairs back into the storage room before departing. The cleanup was almost done now, the trash put in a sealed can in the alley to avoid attracting rats, and all the pots had been thoroughly scrubbed. Which meant there was only one last bit of filth to deal with before Naoto could call it a job done. Naoto stood with the rest of the members of the Rising Sun in attendance in a wide semicircle facing the 4 recruits. To his left stood Tamaki and Suichiro, while Ino and Chihiro flanked him on the right. The recruits stood in a line facing them, the man who'd introduced himself as Hojo in the center. Time to lay down the law. Hajime Tanya has invited you to join us, and has asked for permission to train you up enough that you'll be mildly helpful. Due to her injuries, I had to deny her second request, but she begged for us to offer you the opportunity to serve the cause despite her injury. Be thankful to her, it's by her grace alone that you're here. Naoto remembered the speeches his father had given to crowds of retainers, vassals, and allies at parties, and tried to adopt the confident cadence. It came back to him easily, and it felt natural and right. Tanya's grace only goes so far, though. You will be trained, and you will work hard. You will be broken down and rebuilt into something better and stronger. You will hate it, you might hate us, but you will learn to love the cause, and you will learn to love yourselves for what you can do for the cause. Tamaki, Naoto gestured, and Tamaki stepped forward, will be your principal trainer and your immediate superior. You'll do as he tells you. He's an experienced fighter for the cause, and has done much to help us. That said, he will also be your advocate. If you think anything we do is wrong, or dangerous to you or to a civilian, let him know, and he'll tell me or Ogi. If you think I am being unfair to you, explain your complaint to Tamaki, and he will make your case to me. Naoto gestured again, and Tamaki stepped over and stood beside the line of recruits. He will also be taking care of your quarters and provisions tonight, so stick close to him. And now, before we finish our business up for the night, Naoto dropped his father's cadence, and let a genuine smile cross his face as he looked at his new prospective brothers and sister-in-arms. Let me welcome you to the Rising Sun. It's great to have you here, and I hope to share a drink with all of you once your training's over. Work hard, so you can join us in building a better world for all Japanese. Naoto let the sense of blossoming camaraderie remain for a moment longer, before moving on. Before we go, though, there's one last thing we need to handle tonight. At a nod, Tamaki, Suichiro, and Chihiro disappeared into a back room, while Ino stepped into her side office for a moment, returning with 3 folding chairs and a handful of zip ties. Soon, the 3 Rising Sun members returned from the storage room, each with a moaning burden. Tamaki and Suichiro each had a man dressed in a cheap imitation of a Britannian noble's suit slung over their shoulder, while Chihiro dragged a pink-haired woman out into the hall. All 3 were unceremoniously forced onto the chairs lined up against a wall and zip-tied to the tube frames. To Naoto's mild annoyance, the man with the shattered jaw was still unconscious, although a quick check of his pulse confirmed he was still alive. The other 2 were very much aware, though, and 2 pairs of frightened eyes over gagged mouths tracked him around the room. Turning to the 4 new recruits, the former comrades of the bound men and woman, Naoto offered them a chance to save their lives, if the 4 so wished. Do any of you know of any time that any of these three showed any concern for the average Japanese man or woman, or did any of them ever help the people around them? None of the four spoke, shifting uneasily from one foot to another, before the lone female in their ranks quickly shook her head side to side, almost like she was trying to shake away an annoying fly. Still a condemnation, though. None of them are willing to vouch for these guys. Did any of these three ever display implacable hatred for the Britannians, or a desire to fight the Britannians? Hojo snorted, then coughed, before shaking his head in a firm negation. So be it. In the last month, since Naoto had first given Tanya the authorization to start drawing up plans for the cell and to choose her own assignments, essentially promoting her to a de facto officer rank, he had not failed to notice how the girl's influence and authority had blossomed. Naoto thought of himself as a fairly decent leader, not great, but not a slouch either. He was the son of a minor lord, and had done his best to carve his own path in the world at the expense of the people who had done so much to hurt his mother, his sister, and his people. Naoto knew he hadn't achieved much, but he'd done what he could to make the world a better place the only way he had known how, through beating down the people who had deserved it, and protecting the people who had been beaten down by the world already. And then Tanya had come, and had essentially co-opted his merry band of rebels out from under his feet. For all that she still proclaimed him their leader, Naoto was fairly certain how the chips would fall, if push ever came to shove. And so, in light of the undeniable triumph that had been the station mission, Naoto had briefly considered stepping down and conceding leadership of the group to Tanya. He had, in fact, gone as far as sounding out Ogi about the idea. Ogi had greatly surprised Naoto by telling him that was a stupid idea. Tanya, Ogi had pointed out, was a good leader and would likely improve with the passage of time, but she was also a child. Moreover, she was a child in desperate need of support, handing her the full burden of leadership, of being the one ultimately responsible for everything that happened. Every civilian caught in the crossfire, every empty bed and filled grave, would have been cowardly, a temper tantrum by a man so afraid of being surpassed by a child that he sought to punish her for her success. Naoto knew he was a flawed man, but he'd be damned if he dropped that kind of responsibility onto a child. And so, Naoto had instead thought about how to improve himself and his group to reflect the reality of the situation. Finally, after the events of the night, Naoto finally felt like he understood how the group should be run. The triumvirate that already existed would continue to exist, but duties would be more directly parceled up. Ogi had demonstrated the depths of his empathy and his connections to their comrades, and had proven more than capable of identifying and tackling problems, and so he would be in charge of keeping the group running harmoniously. Tanya was a propagandist's dream, an adorable child with a sad edge coming from a legitimately horrifying personal history, and she had proven her instinctual grasp of theatrics tonight by extending her bloody hand to the gangsters, and pulling them to her side. Coupled with her obvious genius and her incredibly ruthless plans and stunning combat skills, she would both direct strategy and be the face of the movement, as well as continuing to be the organization's trump card. Naoto, meanwhile, would shoulder the nasty parts of leadership. Someone had to make sure problematic elements didn't trouble the leader, someone had to pull the trigger on a potential traitor where the evidence wasn't clear-cut, and someone would have to ensure that the smiling face and open hand were backed with a mailed fist and a knife in the back. After all, it might be evil but necessary to ask a child to fight a war. But asking a child to murder in cold blood is just too much. Too much. And so, Naoto's mouth twitched in a brief, humorless smile. I suppose blood truly will out, in the end. After all, murdering helpless numbers was a long-held Britannian tradition, dating back to the conquest of the homeland itself. He supposed it was time he embraced both sides of his heritage, at least as it was useful to the service of the cause. Nathan Statefeld pulled his pistol, turned from the four recruits, raised his weapon, aimed, and fired. He moved his hand in arc, and fired again, and then once more. 3 dead Japanese slumped against a wall, whole heads slumped low, cranial matter and blood found out behind them over peeling white paint. He did not say anything, did not make any pithy statement or joke at the expense of the dead. This was business, and besides, dead traitors to Japan didn't deserve any epigraph. Kozuki Naoto holstered his pistol, and exhaled the breath he'd been holding. He wanted to feel bad about this, about having taken 3 human lives, but if they wanted to dress like Britannians and act like Britannians, then they could die like Britannians. He turned back to his comrades, and was unsurprised by what he saw. Tamaki looked almost bored, Suichiro looked saddened but stern, Ina looked like she was already thinking about some other task, and Chihiro practically glowed with an ugly self-righteous satisfaction and perverse delight. All present and accounted for then. The 4 new recruits were, as a group, fairly stoic. One of the men seemed like he was breathing a bit fast, but the other 3 seemed unaffected. Doubt these were the first corpses they've seen. Tamaki, get the blood cleaned up, then get the new guys squared away in stash room 3. Grab the sleeping bags Tanya bought before you go. Suichiro and Ino, help them with the cleanup, and then you're free for the night. Naoto turned to Chihiro, and nodded at her. Chihiro, help me get the bodies out back. Gratifyingly soon, Naoto found himself with Chihiro, 3 bodies, a steel can full of gasoline, and a variety of saws and knives. As the dinner had wound down, Naoto had considered how he'd guarantee that the fate of the gangsters who had messed with the rising sun would remain a mystery long enough for him to make the gang who had sent them a moot factor. Ultimately, he had decided to take the typical Shinjuku approach of leave them in an alley somewhere up to the next level, on the off chance that someone bothered to look for them. It was a simple plan that required only the tools Naoto already had access to, and didn't require the waste of the gratuitous amounts of fuel that true cremation required. He had specifically earmarked Chihiro for this task, certain that she'd have the fewest qualms about helping him out with his body disposal idea. Implementing the idea was grisly work, conducted under the harsh light of an electric lantern in the midnight cold of the alleyway behind the rising sun, and Naoto found it surprisingly exhausting. The noble bastard was by no means a stranger to manual labor, picking up work whenever he could to help support his mother and sister, before his father had returned for the pair, and had continued to work odd jobs once he'd moved into the apartment in Shinjuku with Ogi. Yet, the task of turning the bodies of the men and the woman he had killed into anonymous, unrecognizable meat wore at him, somehow. He didn't feel physically tired, as he continued his necessary, self-appointed task, but instead felt as if his internal self had succumbed to numb exhaustion as the hours plodded on. Naoto looked over at Chihiro, who had displayed no sign of flagging enthusiasm, even as she'd slowed down as they continued to work late into the night. Her initial joy when he'd explained his intentions for the cadavers had been revolting, and the zeal with which she had worked had been equally appalling. As the work had dragged on and the novelty had slowly worn off, her enthusiasm had gradually waned and eventually she had looked just as tired and hollow-eyed as Naoto had felt, at least, as much as he could tell such things by the dimming lantern light, as the batteries expended the last of their charge. An hour later, after the last of the work had been accomplished and the majority of the result had been distributed over several acres of Shinjuku, Naoto stood alone in the alley, carefully pouring gasoline over the more recognizable pieces of evidence. He felt empty, his physical exhaustion combining with spiritual weariness. Here, alone, away from the eyes of anyone else, he let himself process the memory of murdering 3 helpless victims, one already half dead. He vomited, remembering the look in the woman's eyes specifically as the gun had tracked her way, the last of the 3 to go. Compared to that, the memories of the rest of the night were merely disgusting, not soul-wrenching. After all, who cared how he disrespected the corpse, when he'd already offered the greatest disrespect imaginable by cutting short the life that had animated it, ending something irreplaceable, something that would never come back again unless the chain of samsara was real and suffering truly was endless, this side of the Pure Land. And yet, Naoto couldn't say that he regretted what he had done last night, as it was well into the early hours of the morning. This is my job, my task. I make problems go away. All for the cause. All for Japan. He thought about how close Tanya had come to death yesterday, and felt strong in his resolve. Those gangsters had been people, but they had also been enemies to those who he held close, and to the nation that he loved. When he had been a young man, first brought back into the Stadtfeld fold after his father's return to Japan, Naoto had spent a great deal of time in the library, reading the biographies of the great men who had changed the world. One of those men had long ago issued a proclamation, the ultimatum of which Naoto murmured to himself as he carefully closed the can of gasoline, set it aside, and struck a match. What will happen to the enemies of the rising sun? They will suffer the same fate as a stone dropped into deep water, they will simply disappear. Kozuki Naoto dropped the match, and watched as the last remains of those who would stand against the light of the rising sun disappeared into flame.